back again with the stream as usual. So I just lost my co-host, the Walrus here. He will be coming back in soon. Let's see. We have 8 people watching. Some of the regulars, hoping some more people will come on or not. I mean, it's still like a very beautiful summer day here, so I will not fault people for being outside and just trying to enjoy the weather. Anyway, today's episode is titled "The Selfish Gene and Its Consequences," which is a sort of the idea for that title I actually got from Vingle, who asked me why I didn't name the Soros episode "The Open Society and Its Consequences." And I just thought, like, dough. Why didn't I do that? That's actually a kind of genius title. So I think that's going to be like the end part of a lot of these episodes that we're going to do in the future. That's going to be something and its consequences. Let's see who is in. Vingle is here. Nice.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Oh, there we go. I don't know what happened. I didn't do anything different from any other time we stream. But,
no, I think it was a funny way to open
technology
open the stream,
being
actually.
what it is. It never works 2 times in a row. Right, I was in the middle of doing my whole spiel about welcome to the Longhouse, but I think we're past the.
Well, I think people know the show, right? That Peter Gabriel did the introduction.
He did, and also, fittingly enough, I see in my YouTube subscription box here that the latest person to subscribe to this channel is Mr. Ted Krasinski. So, welcome to the channel as a subscriber.
Beautiful.
It's fitting. I'm not sure if you got to talk anything about what the topic for today is.
Yeah, I will continue. I mean, we've talked about new atheism previously, and I always felt like this is a kind of specter that sort of haunts all of YouTube, because I mean, these were like the original. If you go back to early 2005, like 2006 YouTube, I remember being in high school and like watching a lot of this atheist content, and it's been extremely formative, I think, for most millennials. Excuse me, for like most millennials, intellectual development. To, you know, they basically got a joint sort of package of learning about fallacies and logic and science, and with that stuff, they got all of this kind of new atheism garbage. That I think it's very, you know, in sort of the, I mean, we talk about de-boomerization. This is going to be like de-millennialization,
yeah,
in a sense of, I mean, not just, you know, looking at the new atheist assumptions, but taking a look at.
Sorry, I was very interested when you brought this up to me a couple of weeks ago, because I remember us talking about. I remember thinking about. One of the episodes that Academic Agent did on his cigar stream, it's probably months ago now, where he talked about nature versus civilization. And there was a discussion for a while about the possible baggage that comes with the right as a whole adopting sort of the evolutionary package as a whole. And everything else that comes with it, and that a traditional right probably shouldn't be so quick to just accept everything, you know, the baby with the bathwater and all that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it's actually, with, you know, the capital T tradition, right, is basically, it does not work with modern evolutionary theory as the scientific consensus is currently, and that's what we're going to look at. What parts of the right actually work with evolutionary theory and what parts doesn't work with it, and how these theories have changed through time, and sort of trying to not only understand how we got here in terms of the current consensus of evolutionary theory, but how, like, all of these changes, all these sort of small paradigm shifts that happened in evolutionary science, geology, zoology, economics, and so on, they sort of lead into this type of new atheist worldview and this kind of new atheist baggage that come with that. So that's where we need to look at both what are the assumptions that come with the mainstream evolutionary theory? What are the assumptions that come with the new atheism? And like, how are we supposed to approach these things? So, are you still there?
Yes, I think I'm still here. I
Yes.
did get a comment from Vingle that my microphone might be picking up. It's picking up the incorrect microphone. So please confirm if I'm sounding better. Also, I fail to see Nord Anon in the chat, so I'm going to have to be extra vigilant tonight in case any bots or mischievous people show up. But other than that, I think we're good to go.
Then we can just start looking at the presentation.
Yes.
So again, just going over the topics that I want to cover: new atheism, the history of evolutionary theory, Richard Dawkins and his best-selling books, The Selfish Gene, from 1976, and the implication of evolutionary theory on right-wing politics and the ideological spectrum. Because there's one thing I've noticed in the dissident right when it comes to our approach to the kind of new atheist crowd is it's been sort of dismissive and mocking of this, of that community. And I was watching one of the streams from Geo, the art guy, when they were talking about this particular topic, like what happened to this sort of new atheism period,
Movement.
and they just sort of concluded that it fussed out because it was just too grim. Like, it just wasn't, it had no positivity. It was just like this very cynical, negative thing that is a bit of a dead end in terms of ideology, in terms of politics and so on. And people were just getting tired of browbeating these sort of traditional religious people and fundamentalists. So, the new atheist community broke off, and the fedora meme came in, like the monkey meme came in, and it was sort of like this mocking dismissal.
The fedora meme almost single-handedly destroyed.
I mean,
in this moment, I am enlightened, or whatever the quote is. Yeah.
But the problem here is that they were not discredited. The problem is that they became uncool. Basically, they just became lame at some point. And but what I want to look at here is that if there's a possible way that we could actually tackle this topic head on and trying to actually discredit some of these new atheist assumptions, and try to deal with like I talked about, the sort of touch and anxiety and some of the squeamishness about these topics, because evolutionary theory is so central to science the way that it is currently, that it's really a mistake to try to just not address to ignore it, as I've seen like with the dissident right, where they will do historical revisionism, and they will talk about historical events that are illegal that could get you into jail, and question everything. But like when it comes to this stuff, I've actually seen very little in terms of
it's one of
approaching this with a skeptical view.
Ideally, in an ideological sense, you would be able to step over it, but you don't live in a world where that's possible. So you're going to have to go through.
Yes, I agree. Like this is something that we can't just sort of pretend that this doesn't exist, especially if you want to be like this sort of very radical, very kind of radical traditionalist, very radical right wing. There's just no way you can make this, both say that this is true and that, I hold this kind of capital T traditionalist worldview.
Yeah.
Okay, then I think we could go to the next slide and look a bit, get a look back at the new atheist brigade.
Clean up some of my tabs here real quick. I forgot to do my usual cleanup when the audio failed to work. Okay, here we go. Early YouTube, new atheism and evolution. Now this series of images, it hurts. Luddic.
I actually get like a visceral.
It hurts to look at it. Yeah.
Sort of stomach reaction.
On a personal level, I have like a cringe reaction, and that this I recognized. I recognize so many of these faces.
I mean, there are probably over 100 channels that are doing atheism on YouTube and that have been doing atheism. The interesting part is that most of these are still active. I mean, not Hitchens, of course. I mean, we could sort of dismiss the four people on the right there that are the four horsemen. because they,
Sure.
they never had like active, maybe apart from Sam Harris, they never had active YouTube accounts where they're continuously publishing stuff and interacting with fans and stuff. It was more like they did tours and speeches, and it was just kind of shared and propped up by the rest of the new atheist community.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned previously, like new atheism, that was the first fad on YouTube, interestingly enough, and it's very interesting to see. Yeah, I mean, in my view, this movement was actually a success. I can read like the sort of Wikipedia definition of what new atheism is. So it says here, the term new atheism was coined by the journalist Grey Wolf in 2006 to describe the positions promoted by some atheists of the 21st century. New atheism advocates the view that superstition, religion, irrationalism should simply not be tolerated. Instead, they should be countered, criticized, and challenged by rational argument, especially when they exert undue influence, such as in government, education, and politics. End quote. And I mean, if you look at millennials' attitudes, you can look at Pew Research and like the lack of religiousness in our generation. They were basically successful, and you can't attribute all of it to this movement, but to dismiss them would be a mistake. I mean, we all went on YouTube, we were all watching this stuff.
As a millennial growing up, where in a godless society as it has become at this point, turning on YouTube and finding all of these smart-sounding individuals saying, God not real. It's basically what you want to hear, right?
You
get such a big brain listening to them. I remember thinking, you're so smart, you're so much cooler than your friends because I listen to Richard Dawkins.
Yes, you're very smart. You're very cool. Like, you're smarter than your parents, and you can own your parents. Like, it's very satisfying to this. I mean, trench coats. I mean, it's very satisfying to the kind of young man brain. If you want to own people,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
You want to prove that you're smarter than other people, so you want to latch onto some new technology or some new theories or something that the old people they haven't caught onto yet, and prove that makes you better than them. It's so like, this mindset. It's so real. Like, it's like the regular, I think, like young white man mindset is that I want to move forward and show that I'm smarter than everyone else in society. So I need something fresh. I needed like a new approach, and they just served it up. Like, this was just the perfect answer for like the demand here. So when you look at this gallery of people, I mean, you asked me to include Armored Skeptic. That's like the guy in the top left there.
Yeah,
so
that was just because we talked about him. We talked about him last week, so he was on my mind. But if you hadn't included like Amazing Atheist and Thunderfoot, and I recognize all of these faces on the left, but I don't remember a lot of the names for the guys in the bottom left. It is Steve Shives. Okay. Is that the one in the middle?
So like, if we go from the bottom left to the right there, then we have, I don't know the name of this guy. I mean, his YouTube handle is Rationality Rules. And right, he's one of the people who came onto the scene later. And in my view, he has one of the better channels. I mean, I don't care for this type of content, but if that's what you're looking for, then I think he has some of the better content in terms of just, you want to learn how fallacies work, or learn how logic works in terms of argument, or look at some sort of how you can discredit and like deconstruct arguments and so on. He actually delivers very much on that point. Like, from, again, stepping once to the right here, you have Steve Shives, which, of course, I put him sort of in the same column as the Amazing Atheist, because both of these people started out more as just atheist YouTubers. So just like this kind of new atheist, attacking superstition, attack religion, attack all of these things. And then later they sort of spun off into more of their own things, where the TJ Kirk that's on top there has become like the poster boy for sitting on your couch jacking off philosophy until you're 40 years old, where like with Steve Shives, he went more of this kind of like hard leftist feminist direction. And I looked at some of his videos recently. I mean, if you look at this entire list, and most of these people make me feel bad, but these Steve Shives and TJ Kirk have to be like the most pathetic people on this list because
Yeah, like Shives, as far as I can, like thinking back on it, because after, I don't know, after Gamergate, I don't remember seeing him a lot. But he strikes me as sort of the epitome soy boy archetype guy, you know.
The reason I hate both of them is really, there's this sort of Eleanor Roosevelt quote, right? We have like great minds talk about ideas, mediocre minds talk about events, small minds talk about people, and then I'm going to add another one like grug brain, micro brains talk about themselves. And like that's where these two come in. Like their channels have just become like these kind of blog channels,
really?
Where they just sit and talk about themselves and their own shitty lives. They don't, I can kind of respect someone like Thunderfoot or Rationality Rules or like Aaron Raw there, because they're actually like talking about logic and philosophy and science, even though I may disagree with them.
I was going to make that exact point, because I was going to say any one of these on the left side who haven't sort of died or gone into obscurity as a channel have drifted towards more popular grifting in some sense, and away from the atheism stuff.
Not so much with Thunderfoot actually, but
except for probably Thunderfoot. But I looked up his channel a couple of days ago because of the slide, and it's a lot more commercial now than it used to be.
It's the dunking continues. I guess that's what's been the permanent fixture here. He wants to dunk on irrational stuff or whatever he thinks is stupid, and make these 30-minute videos where he's just talking and laughing at people. He is insufferable to listen to. I recognize that he's a smart guy, but I talked about like how I hate British intellectuals. Like this guy's like the sort of like the what's that meme? The most humble British intellectual. This kind of extremely arrogant, snotty person who think they just know everything and have to dunk and make fun of other people. That's kind of his brand, but people are into it. But just finishing up the point with Shives and TJ Kirk, like the last video that I think Steve Shives put out there is like, it was titled "My Cat Died and I Dreamt of My Dog." This is like the
Armored Skeptic here is on like video number 1,000,000 about like how aliens built the pyramids.
They're Hyperborea or something like that.
Hyperborea is real, yeah.
But, this could potentially offend a lot of people, but I think that as you develop as a man, as a sort of masculine man, you should move on to talking about like interesting topics or ideas or like visions of how the world should be. If you're in your 40s and you're still talking about yourself,
I'd much more of these guys. I'd much more respect someone like Armored Skeptic or Thunderfoot for doing the dunking or like just talking about, here's a crazy idea, let me just talk about this for 40 minutes without ever showing any proof, instead of basically turning it into a vlog.
Yeah, the same thing with like TJ Kirk. He's just talking about he tries to do more of this kind of leftist talking points, but other than that, I see a lot of these recent videos where he talks about, oh well, I went to my doctor and I got my diabetes medication, I ate a muffin for breakfast, and then I tried to go to the gym, and I went home. Like, who fucking cares? You're 40 years old. Fuck you, right? This is just
nothing better.
It's not interesting, right? You're 40 years old. You're fucking childless. You're sitting on your couch, like making these dumb shit. Like this guy's just a total kind of waste of space in every possible way. I don't think he's ever had a real job other than like promoting the philosophy of sitting on your couch and jerking off.
I think vlog for a moment,
like a sort of net good for the world if he was just like taken away by aliens or just sapped out of existence. He's just not like, other than like spreading this quote unquote mind virus of the sort of hedonist Gen X lifestyle. It's nothing.
Apparently, Kirk was also a big Bernie bro.
Oh,
I don't know.
Imagine my shock,
that,
right?
But imagine my shock. Didn't Thunderfoot have like a bunch of videos? Like where he went on against Sargon and people like that. Well,
I think he's tried to go against most people.
yeah.
I mean, if you follow his career, he will just pick a fight with anybody and do these kind of deep
Gets the
dunks
clicks,
or
I guess.
assassinations. There is a bit of sadism there, but he fits the sort of archetype that the distributist talks about the kind of progressive sadist, basically like this technocratic sadist who, like their main drive of politics, like they get off on destroying people's reputations or making people feel
I would
stupid, like
rather call it
humiliating
like a
people,
witch
right?
hunter almost. It's like if you, I don't know if you're into Warhammer fantasy, but the witch hunters in Warhammer, like they wander around the Empire of Man looking for heresy,
Yeah, yeah,
like sniffing
perfect.
it out, you know. And when they find one, they make a big stink about it, right? So it feels more like that.
Certainly. I mean, the guy to the right of Steve Shives is Aaron Raw. He also does a lot more of these debunking videos, but it's a lot more kind of
That's his
toned
name, yeah.
down. You know, it's not as kind of brash, or he doesn't create as much of a show around it. But I think he's a very kind of permanent fixture in this new atheist community. So to the right of him again is like Hershey Ali. What's her name? You know, I mean,
Hersey Ali, yeah.
yeah, I never saw anything from her at all. Really, I know that she's just always mentioned as like this key figure who sort of I went against the radical Islamists, and
Apparently, yeah.
like
I think I vaguely remember seeing like a Dave Rubin episode with her years ago.
But yeah, she's in the New Atheist Club, but she's not really been a part of the kind of YouTube dunking phenomena in any meaningful sense. I think it's very much a man's game.
It seems so, yeah.
So again, above
Bingle is simping for Ayan in the chat here, and I'm considering the block button here, or maybe a timeout. We'll see if he behaves.
You go to the staircase. You have to okay.
We have a colonizer in the chat.
Bleacher. We got the all right. Above Hershey Ali, we got the debunker himself, Matthew Dillahunty, and like he has this sort of what's the Thinking Atheist call-in show or something? Ask an Atheist. What's the name of that show again?
I don't remember. Let me see. Oh, I'm gonna mess up his name. Let's just try it. Thinking Atheist. The Thinking Atheist is a video. Yeah, that's him, I think.
Okay, it is a Thinking. So it's just like this call-in.
I'm not sure from the website. They don't tell me who's on this.
See, now, Matthew Dillahunty, the Atheist Experience. The Atheist Experience. That's the name of the show. I mean, like he's like one of the final bosses of this movement that's sort of that's been outside of the Four Horsemen. If anybody, I mean, just the amount of work he has done in just trying to argue points, he should probably take Hitchens' place among the pantheon. Just in my opinion,
Hitchens was always more of a showman in my eyes, anyway. He wasn't really part of the intellectual part of this. I don't know. There was just some sort of like intellectual like common thread in between these guys, and then there was Hitchens, who was like this rock star guy.
Well, I mean, I try to, you look at these four horsemen and you try to divide them up into common traits and uncommon traits. So you have two British and you have two Americans. Okay. So you have like two guys that are like gray and two guys that have a little bit of hair. And so and so you have like two scientists, one philosopher, and then you have Hitchens, that's a journalist. And I mean, he fits in with the new atheism part of just like zero tolerance for superstition, religion, irrationalism.
Sure, yeah.
He really put in work in just like dunking. I mean, he was probably the biggest dunker of all of these people here by just showing up to interviews. But yeah, I mean, with Hitchens as well, like he also has this kind of.
He wasn't an important member. I just always thought it was kind of funny how.
His contributions,
these, like, academic guys, and then this guy he's just looking for a brawl, basically.
I mean, in my view, I like Sam Harris was never that good as an academic as I would say Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett.
Fair enough.
Either, and he was much more of like a Sam Harris is much of a sort of subdued figure. Like I mean, he like meditates 3 hours a day, and you can just hear his sort of like sleepy voice. He doesn't create the amount of brawl mood that someone like Hitchens does. But I mean, Hitchens is very interesting because he didn't just dunk on religious people. Like, he wrote a book trying to dunk on the Clinton family, and he was trying to, there's a lot of institutions that he went after. I think he just got a lot of pleasure out of dunking and trying to be superior to other people. His brother, Peter Hitchens, had a lot more interesting stuff to say, in terms of academic ideas and so on. But I do agree with you that in terms of like trying to make intellectual contributions to the kind of atheist canon, he didn't do very much. He wrote the book God Is Not Great, and it doesn't really have any ideas. It's just like the standard, hey guys, did you know that the Catholic Church is not progressive? Did you know that? Wow. Like, wow, I didn't know that. Like, when like what's her name, Mother Teresa, when she goes down to help poor people, did you know that she does that to save them and not to actually make them live longer? Did you know that, guys? Like, that's like his big like whoa, which of course shouldn't be a shock if you've been in the world more than 18 years and you know that people have different motivations for doing things, and that like the Catholic Church, they're doing missionary work to do missionary work. They're not doing it out of just pure charity, and so it's like, and they have a completely different view on death and life and ethics and morality and so on than a sort of progressive, center-left progressive guy as Hitchens. So, I mean, in my view, a lot of his critiques are just kind of pointless. It's just sort of assumed that everybody should be a progressive. And if you're not, you're just a moron, right? You need to get with the times, and you should be dunked on. And I'm going to use like your Christian morals against you and try to tell that say that you're a bad person, even though I don't believe in any objective moral standards and so on. It's very entertaining character.
Very entertaining. Probably not a very nice guy. I see some chats, but I always thought he was a bit of a funny outlier in the group. Soup here says that we forgot the cosmic skeptic. Well, I'm sure we could expand this quite a lot if we wanted to, but in the end, there's only room for so many.
We forgot we've 50 people, right?
Put Carl Benjamin up here, could probably put a picture of me when I was like 12 or something. Not with a fedora, sadly. Let's see.
Yeah, no, we can keep adding to this list. Let's see, are there any more chats?
Well, some people are talking about how Sam Harris is a spurg and a lol cow. Hitchens is
he really tries to be serious.
The Iraq wars, etc. But nothing too interesting. But a lot of good points being made in the chat. Do you want to mention this last fellow of the four?
Daniel Dennett. I think he's
talked
probably
about him already.
Did I? No, I mean, I mentioned him. He is a sort of philosopher, really sort of more classically trained philosopher, and his contribution has been more of like trying to lay the groundwork for more of this kind of naturalist or the sort of scientific naturalism philosophy. It really is just the idea that, I mean, what exists is matter, right? What exists is the material world and neurons and chemicals, and there's really there's nothing else like consciousness or this sort of world of ideas. It's really sort of an epiphenomenon or more of an illusion. And like a lot of the writings that he has is just trying to kind of attack the people who are emphasizing, like you have the idealist philosophers. I mean, you talk about stuff like German idealism and people who talk about, the qualia, like the nature of consciousness, the mind-body problem, and so on. And his view is just like, fuck all that stuff. Like just deconstructing the idea of having a mind at all. And like, if I'm just going to do, if I'm going to do presentations on these people and try to actually, point out weird things about their worldviews and maybe refute some of their ideas, like I think he would be the most difficult one. He has, like, I think contrary to Sam Harris, like Daniel Dennett probably has like actually coherent philosophical thoughts and so some actual credentials. So but it would be interesting to take a look at. He's also less funny because he's just kind of old and doing his own thing. He doesn't do any stunts, or I don't think he's done any dunking at all, and that's why a lot of people don't know about him. Yeah.
Zoop says that maybe the intellectual dark web is another episode. Maybe it is. We'll see. I'm sure
Who's
there's
the
a lot of
intellectual
stuff we could
dark
talk
web
about.
again? That's like Jordan
It was
Peterson, Sam
the-
Harris, and
Yeah, it's what's his name? I can see
Hero
their
or something?
faces. The intellectual
Weinstein?
dark web. Brett Weinstein. Let's see. Let's get everyone.
see, I have an article here.
Majid
So
Nawaz, Steven Pinker, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro, Michael Shermer, but I think that's a bit of an expanded. But Ayan Hirsi Ali and Sam Harris definitely are in there. Douglas Murray, of course. God, Douglas Murray. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna take, I'm just gonna copy Fuentes' take on this stuff. I mean, it's not intellectual, it's not dark.
This is a good question.
It's just centrism.
I try not to psychologize too much, but Madeleine Brooks says, why do you think religion bothered them so much? Ayan at least suffered real harm. What did Christianity do to the others? I agree that Ayan, if nothing else, has a bit more of a of an excuse or an explanation for why she did what she did in that sense. And I think that's also why you put her on the slide, but you already said that maybe she doesn't fit. Because she's kind of stayed out of it, because her fight has always been a little bit different. It's not just dunking on religion, it's more this specific thing that happened to me is bad.
Yes. I think that the comment is sort of under the impression that if you're going to go after someone, you need to have a cause. Like they need to have done something to you first for you to want to attack somebody. And I mean, if you look in nature, the lion doesn't pick out, antelopes because he has a grudge against them. It's just because he finds someone that's slow and vulnerable and like an easy target.
You fuck
and
my wife.
and yeah, it's and that's sort of how I look at someone like Hitchens or Dawkins. So like they saw religion as an easy target to go after, and where they could really kind of go out in style. I mean, I don't know how many people know this, but like Dawkins is actually 81 years old. He's really fucking old. Like, and that means that most of the time he spent doing this sort of new atheist stuff, he was like 60, almost 60, 70 years old. Like, I mean, and now he's older than Joe Biden. He's still very lucid. And I mean, even though people like make fun of him on Twitter and stuff, he's still very much coherent in his speech, coherent in his thinking, and able to sort of, participate in academic debates and so on. But I think like for him, it's just like, okay, he saw a sort of easy target that he could, just attack. That there is also this sort of supremacy angle there.
You also have to consider, that they're drinking the Kool-Aid here. I'm
coming up with a better answer for
they're selling, to some extent. And if you do believe, if you're Dawkins with the background that we're probably going to get into later, I mean, you would believe that the greatest thing or the worst thing to ever happen was the Catholic Church, and it needs to be taken down.
Just to I should have just mentioned this immediately, but for Dawkins, he has not just been attacking religious people. He has been attacking anyone who has another idea about evolution or science than he has, right? And or just participated in that. So I mean, one of his points was that he wanted to sort of push out, all of these kind of people in the southern part of the United States who were teaching creationism as a part of the curriculum. And he wanted like just complete supremacy of this kind of like gene selection theory that he has supported. So I think that's one of his his main mission is to like snuff out any competition to like this particular theory that he's so attached to, and that he has spent his entire life researching and defending. If I were to just say one thing, that would be it. If there's anything else, then I go back to Ted Kaczynski and the idea of over-socialization. Really, that this kind of lefty academics who they're not really brave enough to attack the actual enemy, so they have to attack somebody who the system already hates, basically.
Yeah.
So they feel like they're kind of rebels. But I mean, Dawkins had like a quasi kind of Church of England Anglican upbringing, right? He was never harmed by the church or anything, but he's like this kind of British academic fart sniffer personality, like Bertrand Russell, where he thinks he's better than everybody else. And like he sort of has to rub it in their face, and he thinks that Christianity wasn't good enough for Christianity, and that it's just like this Nietzschean thing, I think.
Yeah.
So that's the explanation. I mean, with Sam Harris, it's like hint, early life section. That's the only thing I'm going to say there.
Yeah.
That's it's really just like everything, in my view, everything he says is like just super elaborate rationalizations for this kind of early life paranoia. I'm not even kidding. That's what I think. Yeah.
I have to make a quick correction here because Julius Flavius in the chat asks, since when do you have the lunar sex in your streams, Wallace? And I think he refers to the comment we just talked about. And I'd like to remind Julius that there are no girls on the internet. So I don't, and I'll never admit to it, and you can't catch me. You'll never catch me alive.
I missed out on the lunar sex part. Is there some reference that I should get?
I just think that the previous commenter was called the Madeline Brooks, which is a female name. The lunar sex is women.
Okay, I'm on board now.
Yeah.
So that sort of covers it. I think for Hitchens, it's basically just pure sadism. With Dawkins, I think it's really like this kind of internalized over socialization, wanting to defend his the stuff that he believes in, and also kind of just defend the sort of British liberalism that he grew up with, through this kind of theory this gene selection theory that he espouses. I mean, with Sam Harris, it's just like rationalized paranoia, and Dennett, I have no clue. I've done so little research on him that I can't really give a diagnosis. I shouldn't give a diagnosis anyway, but I'm just psychologizing.
Yeah. All right. Do we want to?
I think we've covered. Spent enough time on these guys, so we should get into the meat.
Let's be men and talk about ideas instead of people.
Large brains.
Big
so this
brains.
is like the first idea that I wanted to tackle on when it comes to this stuff is really like the relationship, where we talk about the relationship between political ideologies and scientific theories. The first thing that you run into, and that it's like this wall that everybody ends up running into eventually, is David Hume.
Mm-hmm.
David Hume's radical empiricism and the so-called is-ought distinction, which says that you can't derive an is from an ought, and meaning that just because the world is this way doesn't mean we should do this thing.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, just because you can tell me an empirical fact about the world, and you can say that, okay, women make 40% less money than men. Okay, that's an empirical fact about the world.
I have a very good example. Some people who are born have both genitalia. They have a condition called, I don't quite remember what it's called, but they are hermaphrodites in the old sense of the word. Therefore, I should be able to cut off my penis.
Yes, I mean, but
because 0.001% are
therefore
defects,
that's
basically.
trans basically like this Judith Butler paradigm of trans and gender ideology is valid because there's like 0.000 people who have double genitalia.
Yep.
And therefore it's like your theory has been falsified because there's one case where it doesn't work. I mean, there's other examples, like I said, like say with the gender pay gap, that just because like the two genders make different amount of money, then you should implement government policy to do anything about it, and so on.
Luddic. Very different distinction. They earn different.
Yes. Okay, but like here's sort of my problem with this, is that this is something that, logically speaking, and all praise be to Dave Hume, like he was a great thinker, this is logically true, but in reality, it just isn't true. If you create a kind of establish a certain truth about the world, that will inform, the kind of ideologies and the things that is built on top of that. I just, I understand that it's not logically necessary to do it that way, but it always happens.
Well, I mean, the human brain isn't logical or rational, so.
No, I mean, so that's where, say, evolutionary theory comes in. And you get something like social Darwinism, for instance, and that's like a part of this is-ought problem that someone like Dawkins will say, because like the world is just made up of like these kind of selfishly motivated, gene machines who try to just maximize their own chance of survivability on the cost of everybody else, does not mean that we should implement a social system that does the same thing. But my comeback then is like, okay, but what argument do you have for doing anything else? Because if you've sort of denied that there's no objective morality, there's no God, there's no anything, on what basis should we have like a social democracy? If the core of the world, the way that it has been designed, the driving engine of the world is sort of selfishness and just like selfish, self-interest, fighting competition, where do you get the idea that we should do something else? Like it's just really, it makes it really difficult.
Yeah.
Why should we cooperate? Like why should we take care of the weak people?
We talked a bit about this before the stream, where I brought up the view of Sam Harris that the human animal has no free will, but he's also a liberal or very libertarian. Right?
Yeah.
So where's the connection there? I don't have free will, therefore I should be able to have bodily autonomy.
Therefore, we should have the exact status quo liberal ideology that's based on people who were Christian, and
I should be able to do what I want because I don't have any free will.
Exactly. So it's like it becomes this sort of completely weird dissonance with these people, where they will deny any opportunity philosophically, empirically, scientifically of there being anything else than just like this pure material dog eat dog like competition world, but then they will go and say that we should maintain a strong welfare state for some reason, and they could never really explain why, or but we should just do that because it's nicer than the other thing, and they can't explain that. So it is completely inevitable if you have a certain metaphysic, or you have a kind of an empirical model of how the world works, and you create a social system that is basically the exact opposite. I mean, you're just swimming uphill, and you're just trying to kick water upstream, because you're essentially fighting against the natural order of the world. And there's no clear delineation, like, okay, where does biology end and where does sociology begin?
And in that sense, the religious and especially the Christian model is quite successful in that it inverts this by saying that man is fallen. Man is a sinner.
I mean, the Christian system is a complete system. No matter how you can point out that it has like irrational things within it that's not empirically true according to the scientific standards.
Well, but the paradigm we operate under. If your starting point is sin, you can freely define the ought, right?
Well, the ought is also in the metaphysic, right? Because if God created the world and God has a plan for man, then that's is the metaphysic, and that's where you derive the laws. So the is and the ought become the same, and there's no contradiction. The problem then becomes like when they start pointing out that, okay, we have these measuring instruments now, and we can see that, okay, well, you said that this happened that this year or something, but we can't prove that within our current scientific paradigm that has a lot of clout. So one of them has to go, basically, and then they have to throw out the entire system, and they're left with the problem of, okay, where do we get the where does the altruism come from? Like, where does the the reason to be kind to people or to have specific policies, or like you say, why should we have liberalism if you don't believe in free will, or why should we have any of this stuff?
Nordan on here says that Jean-Jacques Rousseau concedes that man is wicked, but then later turns around and says that man is good by nature. Quote, I believe I have demonstrated it. My brother in Christ, where? That's another one.
So that's the sort of the first point that I wanted to get out, is that ultimately it's sort of, you can point out that there's an is-ought distinction here, and that's logically true. It's a completely valid point, but in reality, it just doesn't work. Like the is and the ought will eventually become the same. You can't create a metaphysic or a kind of theory of everything, or it's sort of scientific.
It's true in a vacuum, but you can't guide or live life by it, right?
Yeah,
it's one
just
of those.
Create a system that's completely opposite. So that's the first thing that I wanted out, because this is something that with the points that I'm going to bring up later in the stream, you can keep bringing this point up. You can keep bringing up this sort of is-ought. So I wanted to sort of address that before we go any further. The second point that I wanted to make is that, guys, like, science is not removed from politics. And I think everybody who watches the stream regularly knows that, right? But like, this is for, because I assume that I put the selfish gene in the title, eventually some new atheist person will find this, and they will look at the stream and they'll just like diarrhea
If
spam
you-
the entire comment section.
If someone's watching this who's, I suppose it's possible that you were born, for some reason this exists for such a long time, but so it's possible that you were born at a time where you never got to experience, the whole can I say that word now on YouTube? The whole the illness that spread across the world the past couple of years, and all of the associated debates and debacles. If you've lived through that and still believe that science does not have anything to do with politics, then you can just turn off this video right now.
Yes.
There's nothing more
Or
here for you. You can
if
come
you're
back
alive,
later.
I mean, if you've been watching, what's going to be going on with all this gender stuff, like the transgenderism, I mean, you should see the influence there. Richard Dawkins himself even concedes to this. If you go on his Twitter timeline right now, he has linked an article on the website Why Evolution is True. It's called The Ideological Distortions of Biology. It was released July the 23rd. And he's sort of, the author is just putting out like 10 points of current things that are ideological distortions in the field of biology, including the denial of sex in animals, the denigration of evolutionary psychology, the claim that race is a social construct, and I mean, the list goes on. Basically,
Do they still use the word ethnicity? Or
he uses ethnicity as well, but
Yeah, okay.
I mean, this is Dawkins linking this stuff, right? So it shouldn't be any contradiction here. That I'm saying that politics affect science, and
and
this
vice
is not
versa.
this is not a new phenomenon. Dawkins, as old as he is, he was writing, being kind of an old, like a young guy when he was writing The Selfish Gene in his 30s, and this was in the 70s. I mean, there was like communists and Marxists everywhere in academia, and a lot of the people that he worked with were avowed like communists, right? And the people that he looked up to, and they were basically picking and choosing in terms of hypotheses and what theories they should choose if they fit or didn't fit into dialectical Marxism, which is not really from like this Karl Popper perspective of critical rationalism. It's not like a scientific ideology. It's what he calls like this sort of utopian historicism that's unfalsifiable. So it's not strictly scientific, but people in the 70s were picking and choosing what direction stuff like evolution and zoology and anthropology and geology should go in based on Das Kapital, basically. I mean, if you're still in doubt, you could look into the works of Thomas Kuhn on paradigm shifts in science, which is another thing to think about, where like science doesn't exist in a vacuum, and they will always exist in a time and space where there are certain tools and certain theories that are allowed, and that's kind of the map that you're allowed to explore, and there are certain things that are not allowed. And usually when you run into a wall and when science stagnates, there will be kind of an opening to change the rules a little bit and change the tools that are being used. I mean, say like Newtonian physics would have been the first example, where people were trying to calculate the motions of heavenly bodies using Newtonian physics, but Newtonian physics was lacking. Yeah.
What's fucked up is that you said, these people basically decided the science in the 70s, right? They picked and chose the science. Now you have people today who have basically been born and bred on this stuff, turning around and giving the Council of Nicaea shit because they picked which parts were going into their new Bible. This is basically the same thing happening all over again. I just had a brainwave. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, it's a valid point. But I think I finished my thoughts. I mean, Thomas Kuhn, and I mean, you could just look into the philosophy of science, which like these new atheist people hate. You can look at quotes from like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Lawrence Krauss and these people where they talk about like they just have contempt for philosophy of science. They do not want to have a discussion about like the direction of science or what paradigm do we exist in, and what's the limitations of our paradigm, and what's the limitations of science, and so on. They just want to bash people over the head, basically, with their ideas and snuff out anything that smells of irrationality according to the current paradigm they're in. But times are changing, right? So I think I covered the basis on this point here, just in case. It's just to kind of isolate myself from certain criticisms that will come up when I cover some of the other points.
All right.
So I think we could look at the next slide here. There's a picture from Wikipedia where it's called like the history of evolutionary thought. It's like this long article, and it was interesting to read through because there was so much stuff that I didn't know about here, and I still don't understand all of it, to be honest. But I will try to summarize a little bit about like the different schools of evolutionary thought and where they went and how they mesh with certain directions of ideology within the dissident right and sort of the political landscape at large. So if you look at in the upper left corner, then that's where you have idealism, right? And there we can just go straight back to Plato as being one of the first like true idealist philosophers with the theory of forms. In recorded history, I think he was one of the first philosophers who took a position on the idea of evolution as like the continuation of this stuff.
Yeah,
the stuff that's
here, like, where did we come from, basically? Yeah.
And his idea was that there is like a metaphysical, higher, transcendent realm of perfect forms where all of these like the perfect versions of the human being, the perfect version of the rose and of the bird, and all of these different species, they exist somewhere, and in this world we basically have copies that are sort of that have imperfections. So they're a little bit different, but they all stem back to these forms.
Mm-hmm.
And like this worldview basically does not allow for evolution. It only allows for kind of de-evolution. Things can only degrade over time. We can never actually improve or adapt. It's like these forms are always there, and
it forms a lot of the basis for Gwynon, actually.
Yes.
And then of course Evola as a
exactly
as a consequence of that. Just if anyone's interested in the chat.
And having this metaphysic is really the precondition for holding these worldviews. I mean, you have to, in my view, reject evolution. If you're going to be like a Platonist, you have to reject it. If you're going to be a traditional or sort of fundamentalist Christian, the Bible's the literal word of God, you have to reject evolution. Like you cannot accept that paradigm. Let's say, if you're a Hindu, in that sense, so you believe in this sort of the cycles of time.
Yep.
You have to believe in idealism. You have to reject evolution. If you're like a capital T traditionalist, like you said with the Guanons and the Evolians, you have to believe in this metaphysic. You have to reject evolution. So this is like so it's all well and good to sit and talk about, we're going to go back to capital T tradition and we're going to de-boomerize. But here's like this giant like monkey in the room here. That is just standing in the way of that, is that we have this entire scientific consensus now that's built around, it's been built up for like hundreds of years, building towards this more Darwinian view. It's really almost the kind of opposite of the idealist view here. And even if you're going to go out and say that, I'm based and I believe in this sort of traditional heroic archetypes.
Shouting "return to monkey" from the rooftop isn't going to do anything.
No, and so in the current world, how are people dealing with this problem? And that's where we get back to the new atheism and the early YouTube, because you had on the one side the new atheists, but on the other side you had like the Christian apologetics and the creationists. Say like people like Kent Hovind. I think he's in jail now. Ken Ham is one of the people who is still like kind of used as this punching bag for the remaining new atheists. So like with this, the people I know in the real world and the people I see in the real world who are like fundamentalist traditional Christians, they have basically two routes that they can take. The one is basically the sort of like creationism, where you have to create a rival body of science to basically explain all of the same things that this sort of Darwinian evolution, new geological science, and anthropology, like all of this, the climate science. You have to create like an entirely separate explanation to explain all of these things by yourself, because you don't have like this kind of multi-billion industrial, state-sponsored complex. You're just like going to be one guy sitting in a cabin in Texas writing stuff, and it's just not going to be as impressive. It will never be able to have the same legitimacy.
Call you racist when you hit publish.
Yes. It will never have the same legitimacy, and it will not. It will be gate-kept. It will be kept out. It will be ridiculed by people like Thunderfoot, used as cannon fodder, and so on. So that's the one approach that some people have tried to take. And the other approach that they will take is like the conspiracy frame. That's something that AA talks about with dissidents, where you have like the people who believe that everything is a conspiracy, or say like you're a flat earther, or you're like a young Earth creationist, flat earther. Like you believe that every government is sort of conspiring together to suppress the truth, basically. So everything that comes out in the media, every geopolitical conflict, everything is basically a kind of a lie, right? This is more of like this kind of BitChute style world, right? But that is a worldview that sort of tackles the problem of evolution, because like just like NASA and everything that's produced of this space stuff, like that's bullshit, and the Darwinian evolution is bullshit, and the geology is bullshit. Like everything is bullshit that's made up by the elites, and everything is sort of a conspiracy. And you can have both. I mean, you can have both the conspiracy frame and the creationism at the same time, but the creationism is like very high effort. Like then you actually have to be like this Uberman who's going to stand alone and deal with every snarky scientist and every interjection and just be rejected over and over again. Or you can just go into this conspiracy frame mode where you just say, fuck it, I'm like a Gnostic Christian, right? It's all demiurge created fake simulated world, and I'm just going to live my life and try to live after this sort of idealism. And I mean, of course, there are people who have tried to save idealism in the face of these kind of new scientific developments. Like say Carl Jung, for instance, with the idea of the archetype, where the archetype is like part of the collective evolutionary heritage that because we have like similar brains and similar nervous systems and so on, we share certain, like the ideals are sort of shared inside of the
they're shared
like,
as sort of like like as a cult it something, but it's like a shadow image on the consciousness of a society.
Yes, so it's like almost this non-local thing that kind of exists inside of people's subconsciousness. It doesn't exist metaphysically, it kind of exists inside the subconscious in a sense that we all share into, and that's kind of a way to kind of save the idealism.
If nothing course, else, it's a useful lens to use at times. I remember you showed me, you sent me a link to a compilation of a bunch of like Reddit posts a few days ago. These like masturbators.
The Goon Cave?
The Goon Caves, yeah. I'm not going to show the video because it's probably going to get flagged. But I said that the video was very rough because it was Shodan-esque horror from what's the game?
System Shock.
System Shock, which is sort of like the which is the technological devouring mother, and that's the horror basis for it, right? And all of a sudden you're talking in Jungian terms, right? So
yes.
If nothing else, as sort of like a communication tool, it's quite powerful.
Yes. So now that I've covered idealism, we need to look at basically the alternatives in the middle here. That's like this kind of really weird space where you're getting into the period where evolutionary thought is starting to become mainstream, or it's manifesting in different ways than like the actual just static idealism. And you get into the like this is usually a lot of this you see before the discovery of DNA and the gene in the 60s, where there's really like, okay, people are talking about the actual evolving nature of species and the evolving nature of human beings, but there's no like actual understanding of how this is happening. So you get the view of, say, like I'll look up some of the things that are put in here. Like you have the there's this Jesuit priest that's called Pierre Teilhard Desjardins, who came up with the omega point theory. And he was sort of like a bit of like this rogue Catholic priest, where he tried to sort of integrate a lot of the modern science that was coming out at the time, where like his view is basically like the singularity, where he said that the singularity is like the logos of Christ. And as with evolution, we're sort of moving
into the mega Christ or something.
Yeah, I mean,
Something
it
stupid.
sounds absolutely weird, but that's like the theistic evolution that's moving. It's like God is just moving in towards this logos point. I mean, it was considered a heresy, but like this is still a sort of like, I mean, if you are a scientist today and you're in, I mean, you're a Catholic basically. This is like typically how a lot of them will present their views, is that they have like a theistic view, and they say that, okay, yes, we accept evolution, but it's been guided by God towards this endpoint, right? And that it will be scoffed at by these mainstream academics, but you can still get a place in the broom closet of some university with that view. I mean, if you're an idealist, you're just not invited in at all. Like you're basically a kind of leper. But with this, like a lot of these kind of theistic middle positions, you could get somewhere there. So I'm just going to, some of the stuff that showed up in the article was really things that were, tied to the great chain of being, actually, where we're getting into some of this kind of more like this guy. Let's see if I can find his this Lamarck and Lamarckism, that like he believed that basically in a sort of great chain of being version of evolution, where like you go from the great chain of being with the lower life forms toward the higher life forms, moving toward God. And evolution is basically driven by this kind of will towards life and this will towards more complexity and to getting closer to God, where life itself is sort of like spontaneously generated.
It's very strange because it's like a weird fusing of evolution, progressivism, and like religion.
Yes, I mean, and that's the problem with a lot of these middle positions, is that like progressivism is baked into the cake here. Like it's impossible to say that the evolution we're going through is guided without taking a progressive stance. So just, I mean, say you want to take that position to synthesize your religious belief with the current scientific consensus, but then you just concede progressivism. And the Darwinians don't have to do that. Like if you're a Darwinian, you don't have to concede anything in terms of progress. You can just say that there's an adaptation. But with these theistic evolutionary thinkers, that is sort of a given.
Yeah, because you're not going to get a theistic evolutionary thinker who says that, like the idealists say that we're degenerating.
Oh, that can't be right.
Yeah.
But Lamarck, Lamarckism is really the idea that, I'm just going to explain it simply the way. Let's say that I'm a bodybuilder, right? And I start training my muscles, getting really strong. And if I have kids, then they will inherit like the ability to build strong muscles, basically, which was sort of like that's. And it's not really, it's not something that's common now. How should I put this? The idea of epigenetics, if you're familiar with that, it actually kind of supports that idea, where not in the sense that my child will inherit my bicep size, but the idea that there are certain things that you can do that will affect the genetic expression.
Yes.
Within the child, basically. And this does not work very well with like this Dawkins gene selection theory. Like that's a very kind of static view. So Lamarck first came in and he proposed that idea.
Theory that, your environment growing up has an effect on, I mean, we're getting into Ed Dutton type arguments here, but the idea that your environment growing up can trigger certain things in your genes and in your body to happen either slower or faster.
Yes, and
I think we talked about that a couple of streams ago, but as an example, something like that throws a bit of a wrench inside a lot of the things Dawkins talk about.
They do. And that's why he talks about it's like neo-Lamarckism. Like he does not like epigenetics, even though he will use it on occasion to defend certain positions that he has. So Lamarckism came in as like this idea that, okay, if you have like a giraffe that stretches, its neck further, then their children are going to keep stretching, and they can sort of, keep, stretching further and further and specializing. And the people who are not doing that, they will just die off, right? And it's kind of wrong in accordance with Darwinian evolution, but it opens up an idea. Like it's sort of like a fertile fallacy, as George Soros would say, that it's kind of not entirely correct, but it opens up the idea of like traits being inherited and specializing further in the genetic line.
I found an image of it.
Yeah, yes,
where it
perfect.
explains it. Now,
This looks like a
besides
shit
everything
post,
we've just
basically.
said, yeah, besides everything we've just said, this looks like an amazing, like, Bronze Age pervert style. That's not true, but one of the Greek posters on Twitter, which is like, you have to get strong muscles and your sons will inherit your muscles, type shit posts. Someone should make this without the Lamarckism. Just, young
nice.
man, you need to be a blacksmith because your sons will have strong muscles. That's something we need to tell them. I wholeheartedly endorse this.
Okay, so but that's John Baptiste Lamarck. We'll get back to him a little bit later. The idea of vitalism as well, it follows the same idea of, I mean, this takes on a lot of forms.
Sorry,
Going
Julius Flavius had a funny comment. I'm not going to pull it up just in case we get in trouble.
This sort of woo-woo stuff where they talk about, the will to live or evolution being guided by this kind of inner drive or like this inner force towards like a higher purpose. Or people who talk about, like life is actually guided by electric fields. Like that's the reason that evolution can happen. It's not entirely biological in like the standard Darwinian sense. So structuralism, I don't really have that much to say on. I thought it was kind of obtruse how to figure out how the people who are actually applying this. But it becomes like a sort of middle stage here where we look at mutationism and we compare it to Darwinian evolution because, like if you go a couple of 100 years back, the scientific paradigm and the time horizons they were, assuming the Earth had existed were a lot shorter. I mean, for quite a long time, they believed in like the sort of literal biblical timetable where the Earth is 6,000 years old, six to 4,000 years old. And if you're going to have Darwinism in that time space, like it needs to be like very rapid, drastic shifts between, say, one species to another. And like that was the thinking in the beginning, that these things have happened very rapidly, and there's been like these catastrophes and larger events that have occurred that have sort of pushed these species to develop in this direction. Whereas the difference between that and the kind of Darwinian worldview is that the Darwinian is like very slow, and it assumes like an extremely long time span with very like gradual mutations over time. Okay, but we could flip to the next slide and we could look more at Darwinian evolution. That is like the sort of current paradigm. I had to put things in a table here because, I mean, if you put too many things in like the bullet point list with this like PowerPoint theme and the type head, it just looks like a complete mess. So now we have like a slightly tidier view of it. So on this table, I've basically listed out what I think is sort of historically the kind of critical ideas that contribute to the sort of paradigm shift that leads into Darwinism, and a little bit of what comes after. So we're just going to see here how we're sort of breaking away from this kind of idealist, more this kind of Christian idealism, gradually breaking away from it into what's considered like modern evolutionary theory. So let's see, the first guy on my list here. Like, his name is so long that I couldn't get it into the PowerPoint. It's I'm going to butcher it, but it's George Louis Larec Comte de Buffon, who's a sort of French multidisciplinary scientist. Like they were at that time, they would just be in like every discipline. Everyone was like a geologist and a biologist and a mathematician and a chemist and so on.
Comte de Buffon must be his title, isn't it? Comte is a title.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he wrote like a 15-volume book that's called Histoire Naturale, Journal Noalis in particular. That's the French. It was just written in French, translated later. And in in volume 14, he sort of argued that all of the world's quadrupeds had developed from an original set of like 38 species of quadrupeds, or just 38 quadrupeds. Sorry, not species. And so he put forward that idea that like they started out with just some simple species, and they've kind of mutated out into all of these various species. And that's the sort of idea that breaks a little bit with the idealism. And it's not something that he could actually argue in any empirical sense. He had just been like walking around looking at nature, and he wrote it down. It's like, yeah, this is probably how it happened. And Again, no real arguments, but it's sort of like he put the idea out there, right? And it kind of stuck.
Based Frenchman. just inventing new ideologies. Yeah.
But that's what you're going to see with a lot of the stuff here. It's like it's not really something that they have like a very strong logical or empirical grounding for, but they will just have intuitions, and they'll just throw them out there like
exemplary post-revolution France, though. I just rationalized myself into this, so therefore it must be true.
But even though it's not like a very empirical truth, it could open the door for new theories that could come later that would have a utility in some other sense. So Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations is someone I put on here. And if you look at some of the presentations on YouTube or the articles on Darwin and Darwin's influences, he's not listed. But I was watching lectures from F.A. Hayek. Basically, if you know, he's like the sort of Chicago school economist who wrote The Road to Serfdom.
Yep.
One of these free market economists. And like he's very read on this stuff. And I think he knows more about Darwin basically than most of these kind of like master's degree people who do these things on YouTube. And he said that the emerging science of economics, as sort of liberal economics in the Wealth of Nations, was a big influence on Darwinism. And he says
I think that's very true, because anyone who's studied any economics and then read either just part of or just a theory of evolution as presented by Darwin can see the influences of the way of thinking that is used in economics at that time. It is basically the same model applied to nature.
Exactly. And it's very, like, already here you can sort of see that, because we look at economics and it's a very discredited science. I mean, most of the people today, when you tell them about, London School of Economics economists, and like they're just going to scoff at you because they look at these people who have created all these models that led to neoliberalism, that led to all these crashes, and who they were unable to predict any crash. They were unable to actually remedy these situations. They just made things worse. And it seems to be almost a consensus even among the lay people that economics is just like this bullshit science, even though it has a lot of good ideas. Like the model is
it's just I think it's just being used wrong, or when people encounter it like that, it's used wrong, because I don't think any economist that works as an economist is in the business of predicting the future, right? They're just trying to find models that explain reality.
Yes.
Now, you can say that is nerdery and circle jerking and academic stalematism, but they were never intended to tell you how things ought to be, or how it's
the difference, I guess, between the sociologist and the psychologist and the economist is that the economist sold themselves in as like this quasi-natural science, this kind of physics envy science, where they were, we got these mathematical models, right? We got all this math and all this complexity, but I mean, there wasn't that much mathematics in Adam Smith, but we can sort of acknowledge that there's a very tight coupling between Adam Smith and English liberalism. Like, this is not something that could have come out of someone in China or, someone in let's say, Latin America or something. This is like a particularly British way of looking at things.
I mean, the invisible hand could only have come from a British Christian economist, right?
Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up.
God, he's substituting. He's like saying it's the will of God that moves the markets, right?
Well, I mean, that's what I would say. It's like the biggest, ideas from the Wealth of Nations that influenced evolutionary theory. The first one is the invisible hand, where it's like if you just allow people to pursue their own self-interest, that will produce the best results. Like, that will produce complexity. That's where you get into like this blind watchmaker idea, where high levels of complexity can be produced by people pursuing their own self-interest. And that's not something that's obvious to people, especially from this idealist position. You think very top-down. Like, top-down thinking is sort of essential from the idealist position, and having like an upper class who make decisions and who are wise and so on. Whereas this is the exact opposite. This is like just dumb nodes on a network that just make decisions that are selfishly good for them, and that creates a better result than you could get from like these kind of virtuous high-level planners.
Yep.
The other idea is really sort of the division of labor, or the specialization, where it's like people can fill different niches by specializing, and basically that contributes to like a higher level of wealth than you could have gotten by everybody trying to do the same thing. And you see a lot of that in evolutionary theory, where the differences in species development is sort of explained by the availability of resources and the kind of niches that they fill in nature. All of these species have some kind of function to, or at least most of them, to the overall ecosystem. So, okay, so we have those two ideas. So now we're at basically, okay, species come from kind of the same. It starts off with like some simple species and moves out from that. The invisible hand with like order out of just self-interest that is unregulated.
Yep.
And then we're moving on to James Hutton, who was a geologist. It was not a evolutionary biologist or a zoologist, but his contribution was basically what is named there as sort of uniformitarianism, which, to just explain that without being too complex, it's when you look at, as a geologist, you try to look at nature and you look at mountains and rivers, and how did that come about? Like, the reigning idea of how that happened when he was active was the idea of catastrophism, where we're still at the sort of point where we believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, according to the Bible, and the rivers and the mountains have been formed by catastrophes, like say like the flood. Like the flood of Noah, that created, a large movements and shook up things in the environments. And like the reason why you have the peaks and the valleys and the things that they look is that there were big events that have formed it, and they were formed on like a very short time period. But he introduces kind of a different paradigm where, okay, let's say instead of the world being 6,000 years old, the world is like 300 million years old, and this has happened very gradually. And we are now going to assume that the laws of nature that are at work now, they have been at work for millions and millions and millions of years, instead of thinking that this has happened by catastrophes. Yeah. And as pointed out in the article, like, this is not a falsifiable theory. Like, you can't really falsify the idea that, say, like the law of gravity has always existed.
Yeah.
Like gravity has existed the same way it did now 2 billion years ago, or that electromagnetics has existed the same way. It's just an assumption that you make, but it's an assumption that really turns everything upside down in terms of how you approach other sciences as well as geology. So this is like huge. This is like a gigantic change in how science is approached when we just say that.
It changes the way you think about things as well.
Yeah,
because and that's why you get the gradual change of the origin of the species, right?
Super long time span, very gradual change, instead of like top down, what you consider like the sort of God makes decisions top down, changes the environment. It's really just happening as a result of gradual change over time.
I just had if there's any big meme boys in the chat who likes to make memes, who are aware of the format of the guy placing a domino and it gradually becoming larger and larger each step, and you have in the first tiny domino you have like some Frenchman writing about plants, and then on the last one you can put like tranny generals.
It's like Rachel Levine at the end of it. But
sorry, continue.
No, but it's good stuff. But I mean, this is, bringing it back to the new atheism stuff. You've probably heard a lot of these arguments where you have like this sort of theists arguing against the atheists, and the theist will make the argument that God created everything, like he is sort of the first cause, and that is kind of a sound sort of logical position. But they will just argue that no, like the earth has, like the universe has existed forever, like gravity has just always existed. And that's kind of a simpler explanation. That's like the Occam's razor. It's simpler to assume that gravity and all of these nature's laws that allowed the universe to exist as this, that's just always been there. That's easier in a sense. That's fewer assumptions than assuming a creator, which I don't really agree with, but you can see where they're getting these ideas from. Like
I
that
feel
is
it's about equal, but yeah, I can see why they would think that.
so that is sort of the uniformitarianism at play there, where it's starting to come in, and people just say that, well, this has just always been here, and that's how we should interpret everything, and that turns everything upside down. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, we've already covered him, right? But he sort of puts in the idea that that you could specialize in different things, and that sort of specialization is carried over, and that's also just an idea that's put out there, and that turns into like the random mutation is created, and if the random mutation is beneficial, then that's carried over into basically into the future, and that creates the foundation for like new species over a very long time period.
Yep.
So then we get to Charles Lyell, who's also a geologist, where he basically says that no, it's not. Now we're going on like even older. He basically just expands the James Hutton stuff to, because Hutton probably said that, okay, we're looking at some 100,000s of years, and then I probably said like millions, but he said he didn't draw it that far. Charles Lyell said it was now we're working on hundreds of millions of years, and I mean currently, I think the consensus is that the Earth is like billions of years old. Let's see if I Google it, how old is the Earth, and search. About 4.5 billion years old. So that's what like the current scientific consensus is. But at that time, we've sort of moved it from, okay, it's 6,000 to like a couple of 100,000s to millions or hundreds of thousands.
I mean, the leap is quite.
Yeah. We keep just moving the time scale back, which changes how people look at science. The next guy on the list here is then Thomas Malthus, who people have heard of. Like he's used almost as a kind of pejorative, almost like with Malthusianism.
Malthusian, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people are talking about it with like the Marvel movie Endgame, like with the character Thanos, who has like this mission to eliminate half the population because overpopulation is just creating all of these problems. And like that was the idea of Thomas Malthus, is that he says that populations can grow exponentially, but food supplies cannot. So they're sorry, I'm just going to cough a little.
I mean, you see already here. I mean, we're about 100 years, I guess, from the original writing here, and already we're talking about like drastic managerial programs that's going to probably murder millions of people.
Yeah, and this guy was very influential on a lot of people, where he said. I mean, he didn't make it managerial explicit, but he just basically said that, okay.
No, but it is by its nature.
If the population can grow exponentially and the food supply can't, then some people have to die. Basically, there's going to be a correction. And I mean, if we look aside from the Marvel comics movies, this is something you have to take into account when you look at species in sort of nature. That a certain, say, a species of bird, for instance, they will remain at a sort of constant number within like a biosphere. A certain biome, they will have like say there's like 100,000. It's a little many. Let's say like there's 1,000 eagles, right?
Yep.
On an island, and that number is going to remain constant over a very long period of time. And if you take like his idea into account that populations grow exponentially, if food is available, then that means that there's going to be a constant termination of people. Like a lot of people or a lot of creatures will have to die constantly.
Yeah.
And that is sort of like the next brick in the puzzle, where okay, now we have a very old, very long time scale from these geologists. You have the Lamarckism with like the specialized traits. We got the Malthusianism with people have to die constantly to maintain a population on a sustainable level. We got Adam Smith, basically like organization by the invisible hand. Like there needs to be no top-down organization. You could get order from basically just selfish individuals. And the Comte idea that everything species come from like the same. They originate from the same like parental species. And when you put all of these together and you take a new look at biology, you get the idea that, okay, these species basically mutate over time. The most fit within that species, they are able to carry on their genes. The unfit are not able to carry on their genes. And so in that way, like that's how species develop over time. And that's also the reason why you get other newer species. If you click on the URL under Charles Darwin, we could look at the Wikipedia article where there's a sort of the bullet point list of all of the kind of tenets of Darwinism, and I think we should just go over them.
Yeah, I'll bring it up. See here. Did we have it here? Yeah, summary here.
There's a summary. Yeah, there's a summary. Let's see. I don't know if you could zoom in a little bit. Okay.
Is this better?
So there we go. Much better. Okay. First point here. Every species is fertile enough that if all offspring survive to reproduce, the population would grow. So that's Malthus, right? Fact.
Yeah.
Next point. Despite periodic fluctuations, populations remain roughly the same size. Fact. Again, with Malthusianism. Resources such as food are limited and are relatively stable over time. Fact. Yeah. Thomas Malthus. Struggle for survival ensues. Inference. So this is kind of the if there's any point that is sort of controversial here, it's this one, right? That there is that this has to be looked at as a struggle and not as a sort of cooperative effort. And if there's a struggle, who's the struggle against? Is it like the species against nature? Is it like the species where the members compete against themselves?
Yes, that's an interesting point, because I mean, if an animal is pure instinct, I mean, what's a struggle to an animal? Like, really, in a metaphysical sense, the lion, as you said, doesn't really have a concept of what it does. It just is.
Yes, and so this is, if there's any point that's sort of controversial or being contended, it would be this point. And that's what we're going to look at with some of the other thinkers. Next point, individuals in a population vary significantly from one another. Fact, yes. So much of variation is a heritable trait, and this is the Lamarck. That's where you get the Lamarckism.
Yes.
Okay, individuals less suited for the environment are less likely to survive and less likely to reproduce. Individuals more suited to the environment are more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce and leave their heritable traits to future generations, which produces the process of natural selection. Fact. Okay. And the last point, this slowly affected process results in populations changing to adapt to their environments, and ultimately these variations accumulate over time to form a new species. Inference, right? So that's, I guess, the other sort of contentious point there, or where if you're the creationists, right, that's where they will sort of actually, there's a difference between like macro and micro evolution, and you can have adaptations within species, but you can't have one species changing into another, and that's sort of a question really of the time frame, right? Because the idea of having like the billions of years of time frame, that's what makes the last point possible.
Of course, yeah, because it's a slow process.
Yep. Right. Then we could go back to the slides again, but I think that this summary is pretty nice in just trying to understand what is being proposed here.
Could the struggle for survival be an influence of the wealth of nations indirectly?
Yeah, I think so as well.
It's selfishness. It's a struggle in the sense that it's every man for himself.
It's very British in the sort of British liberalism. Yeah. I think that's where that comes in here, and that's what we'll see. So in 1864, so that's about 5 years after this book has been released, you have Herbert Spencer. That's like this British, a little bit more controversial philosopher, who writes a book called The Principles of Biology, where he outlines social Darwinism basically, and he says that based on this, he's the one, Herbert Spencer, who originates the idea survival of the fittest, right? And that idea of nature's just gonna have to sort them out. I mean, everybody can just participate in the economy. Not everybody's gonna survive, but that's not really a problem. And of course, that was just accepted at the time, whoa, what a great idea. But later they've sort of disavowed it because it's not optical. But I mean, in my view, his point stands. It's a completely logical point to read the origins of species and just say that, okay, well, then we should just structure our society in terms of social Darwinism. There's no reason why we should bother with anything else.
The is part of the
yes.
Of the line here. I mean, this is assuming that you also accept everything up until this point as well. But within the frame,
it certainly does. But the last guy I put on here, do you know who Peter Kropotkin is?
I've heard the name. I have
See,
never read.
he is actually the father of like ancoms. He's like one of Chomsky's favorite authors, and I had like no clue that he had written on this topic.
Yep.
But already here, we can sort of see like the ideological split, where like Kropotkin, he looked at the origin of species. He looked at the sort of like
Did he
Herbert
write,
Spencer's principles
sorry,
of
did he
biology.
write Conquest of Bread? Hang on.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah, okay, so
that's him. Like
that's where I
he's
got it
also
from.
the father of BreadTube, right? And
that's
he
where I
like
got it from.
he picked up on that stuff, and he immediately saw that like this is like implicitly ideological. Like this is implicitly like British capitalist. This is just supporting British capitalism. So he wrote a book that's called Mutual Aid: A Factor of Evolution, where he argues
where
for
this was headed.
yeah, he just basically argued for like group evolution or sort of group selection. Is that
Bio-Leninism, basically.
Instead of focusing on like the struggle, the animals struggling against themselves for power, the animals have to cooperate against nature. Like they have to cooperate against weather and natural disasters and like a lot of these other things where they have to specialize. And like you have a lot of this bio. I don't know what the word is, like this species that sort of help each other out. And they've developed and evolved to kind of with the bird that sits inside the mouth of the crocodile and to pick out the ticks.
Or the fish that live off of like the bugs on larger fish.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like this is like more of his book, that it just emphasizes that no, it's evolution is actually about social cooperation to survive. It's not about the struggle of all against all and survival of the fittest. And I think this is why the Marxists have been so successful, because they immediately picked up on the fact that, okay, here's some new like cutting edge science stuff that's coming out, and these liberals are immediately taking it in a capitalist direction. So we have to create our own kind of counter view of evolution to basically stop this from being like the consensus. So I mean, like with this book, Mutual Aid: A Factor of Evolution, I heard like in a clip from Noam Chomsky that I mentioned it, but I never took it seriously. But like, this is apparently like it's not a discredited work. It's actually a completely valid interpretation from the perspective of what they knew then, because this is before molecular biology, right? There's no DNA at this point. There's nobody who knows about chemistry and how the inner workings of the body and so on, and genes, pairs. So it's really a much more kind of like broad, almost philosophical thing.
Yeah, it's almost metaphysical in its construction here. Yeah.
I think I covered everything here. So now we could start looking at the selfish gene a little bit. I mean, the reason that I just had to kind of explain how we got to Darwinism, because now that we're at Darwinism, and we're at the point where people are just taking like, okay, Darwin is basically the origin of species. We take that for granted, but now we're kind of fighting over, okay, what's the implication of that, and how do we interpret the kind of struggle, this kind of gradual struggle for survival? Is that some kind of a cooperative thing? Is that a group thing? Is it an individual thing, and so on? So let's see here. So to understand the selfish gene, I mean, I could just start listing off the chapters, but I need to just explain the background of this. Like, these ideas are not Richard Dawkins' ideas. Richard Dawkins must be understood as like this kind of science popularizer, like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He didn't come up with most of these things himself. He is just trying to make this book that's really, I mean, it is kind of like this, what he calls New York Times bestseller pocketbook for this sort of regular midwit person to read and to learn about biology and so on. But it's really the ideas from the biologist George C. Williams and his book Adaptation and Natural Selection that is sort of the foundation for most of the ideas that come in here. Where I mean, and what that book is about is really the book Adaptation and Natural Selection is a rebuttal to other evolutionary thinkers like Wynne Edwards and Alfred Emerson and A.H. Sutherland that are basically group selectionists. And that's sort of what he's contending with here. It's like the people who say that, evolution is operating on the level of the group, basically, and what determines who survives and who is fit to survive is really their usefulness in making the group survive. And in that sense, like altruism is really a part of evolution. They'll bring up a lot of examples of say like a bird, for instance, who will, when you have like these, what do you call it, like these herbivore birds, and you have the birds of prey. I'm not sure what the scientific term for the herbivore bird is, but they will, when there's birds of prey around, it could happen that one bird will, call out and give up its position to protect the other birds, or to sort of pretend that it's sort of vulnerable, and kind of like sacrifice itself or put itself in danger to protect the other birds. And you have a lot of examples of this happening. I've been say like with ant colonies, for instance, where ants will sacrifice themselves for the colony. Like a lot of these, the way that these species are organized, where it's completely normal for one unit of that to sacrifice themselves to die for the group to survive. And like biologists like Wynne Edwards, he talked a lot about how he wrote a book on it. And he had a lot of explanations as to, I made these observations, and what I understand is that animals are basically altruistic. They believe, everything they do is for the survival of the group. And he made he put out a lot of arguments for why that was the case. The problem is that I think he left out a little bit too much. Like a lot of his ideas were a little too rich, like the idea that groups self-regulate in their populations, where he will talk about, like, say, like you have like a flock of birds that will assemble like in an open space. And like he says that the reason that they're doing that is that they need to kind of assess the size of the group so that they can sort of plan for, like, what's the correct amount of children to have in the next season and so on. And like a lot of these arguments are very, they stretch quite a bit in terms of logic, even though they're very good at explaining things. They're a little bit too easy to attack. And that's a lot of the work that's being done in the book Adaptation and Natural Selection, is just attacking, these group selection ideas, and going back to this sort of Occam's razor of there's way too many assumptions. Like there's just way too many assumptions here, and we don't need all these assumptions. We can just explain this from the part of the individual selfishly doing this, and like they have a sort of selfish reason for doing this that's kind of simple to understand. We don't need all of this kind of group stuff. Like it's too big and too unwieldy. And another part that's enables, like, or sort of like that this book is about, is really the discovery of the DNA. And that's something that was discovered by like James Watson and who's the other, Harold Crick, in the 60s. I mean, most people know James Watson for being like this kind of acid head, and for saying stuff about black people being stupid that had people remove his Nobel Prize. But like he discovered the DNA in the 60s, and that's actually very recent. And after like DNA was discovered, it's just been like this, that's just been, front and center of everything in biology, even evolution, where it's like that has to, now we can't think about biology in terms of the species or using these abstract concepts. We have to basically center everything around molecules and gene pairs and phenotypes that come from like these kind of genes. And the, let's say, game theory as well. We have the mathematician and biologist John Maynard Smith, that, game theory was really big in the 50s, coming into like the sort of Cold War stuff. And in the 70s, it was adapted into biology, where they started to use a lot more of these computers to model scenarios for, how things would play out in the animal world in these kind of struggle for survival, and how animals would make choices. So that's kind of a part of this book's rebuttal to group selection, is that it's too many assumptions for one, and we can use basically a kind of DNA-centric view that's centered on like these kind of DNA strands that we call genes, that kind of express themselves in one or more phenotypes. That's basically like traits, like the size of your nose and the space between your eyes and so on. And a lot of what is like a lot of these group selection questions can just be explained by game theory. And that's kind of the heart of the critique here. So like the starting point is really, altruism in the animal kingdom. Where does it come from? And like with the group view, if the animals are basically They look at group as like that's the unit that has to survive. It's like a collectivist society. You know, you have to sacrifice yourself. Then altruism is just kind of natural, like that's kind of in programmed into them, and they've been selected for the ability to be altruistic. But he like in this book, they present a lot of these critiques to that idea, where they basically will put out stuff like, you know, the free rider problem. That's like, okay, well, what happens when you get selfish individuals in altruistic populations is that they will, you know, just be selfish and not reciprocate.
Like the cuckoo, for example.
Yeah, like the cuckoo bird, and this will just continue until there are no altruistic animals left in the tribe. Like that's one of the core sort of arguments that, okay, this is one of the reasons why group selection can't work. And another argument that they use against group selection is that it's really not clear, like aside from the Occam's razor stuff, it's really not clear like where do you divide the line between one group and another. Which is of course this kind of like bullshit thing that you hear, like if you remember the Sargon Richard Spencer debates, like, you know, who's white, right?
Yeah.
It's like that kind of an argument. It's like, who's the actual lion,
white?
Right? We don't know. Oh, we don't know where, like, what separates like one zebra from an antelope and from this thing, and well, maybe, you know, the entire mammal species is a group, and maybe, you know, this lion should stop eating the zebra because, you know, they're both mammals and they should go eat fish instead. And like, I'm making the stupid voice here, but like that's a lot of these serious arguments that they're making. Of course, they're not. You know, I mean, these arguments are not empirical. They're not empirical. They're just, in a sense, the merit that they have is that, okay, we can say that with our definition of this sort of Occam's razor, we have less assumptions. You know, game theory is not empirical, and logic, in a sense, is not empirical, but we can present a model that has less baggage.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, but the problem is that, I mean, you can just keep going like this infinitely. You can say that, okay, well, you know,
there's
maybe
negative space here when you're cutting away.
Yeah, yes, you are actually cutting away things. You're not just like picking two equal hypotheses. You're basically removing your ability to even explain anything in the end. But I mean, let's say the example, for instance, with the like who's white, like who's a lion, for instance. You could say, okay, if you watch the movie The Lion King, I mean, that sounds like a completely silly example, right? That I would use that, but you could try to abstract it and take away the animism and like the anthropomorphism in that movie, and just say, okay, what's the story of The Lion King? You have like this kind of lion kingdom where you have the kind of king lion. He has an evil brother, and the king lion has a son, and he that's Simba, and he explains to Simba that, you know, there's a circle of life, right? There's this kind of like natural order to everything, and we eat the antelope, and then we defecate, and then that goes into the ground, and then the grass comes up, and like this there's this ecosystem here, right? So we have to be respectful of the nature around us. We can't be greedy here, and play our role within this larger system. Otherwise, things will fall out of balance. So then you have like this kind of Hamlet twist where he's killed by his evil brother, and the son is banished. And what happens when the evil brother comes in is that they team up. They do this stuff where they team up with the hyenas, and they start over-consuming. Like they just over-consume the entire environment, leading to basically their inevitable destruction.
It's like a wasteland when he returns.
And you can make the argument that, like, if animals, in a sense, if they can't moderate themselves on some level, if they're just like completely greedy and they have no way of like they just over-consume everything, they will just destroy the environment they live in, and they will die themselves. So you could argue that that's kind of an evolutionary.
This is like problems they have. I remember like reading reports from like what's the islands called? The Darwin Islands, the
Galapagos.
The Galapagos Islands, where they've had like issues with foreign species, and then they bring in another species to sort of like try to curtail it. But it usually ends up with like someone at some point planted a goat on an island, and now there's like 1 million goats and there's not enough grass, so they just keep dying, right? Because they've basically ruined the entire island, right?
This is something that happens. And with the other argument, that's sort of like the free rider problem. I mean, there are many ways of groups to punish free riders. I mean, what do you think, like this sort of entire heritage of Christianity and like the morality, what do you think it is? I mean, it's really about like punishing free riders, basically. You want to have a system where people are awarded for altruism and punished for selfishness. Like, I mean, if you cheat on somebody's wife or you steal somebody's money, you will be exiled. I mean, that is basically like, we will just exclude you because we don't want that in here. We're going to maintain this more of this like this group centered, altruism centered thing. And there are ways that animals can do that as well. They can punish, basically animals who are not contributing or who are sort of too destructive to kind of be in the group. That's also not something that's kind of unheard of, but it's but the problem is that then, someone like Dawkins can come up with another argument as to why that is wrong. And we're just going to go in this kind of theoretical hell circle because none of this is actually testable in any kind of strict scientific reproducible sense.
It's just a bunch of a model circle jerk fight.
Yes, it's just a model circle jerk. We just make a bunch of assumptions. And they can make more assumptions, and my assumptions are better than your assumptions. And we just get into a kind of war of assumptions here. Where it becomes like
it's an
ironically
race, basically.
Ironically the survival of the fittest, where whoever is able to be the elite within the academic circles,
modern academic circle,
whoever's the elite here is just going to decide what evolution means, and that's kind of where
whoever's the
here.
elite gets to go on. That's a very strange.
And that's not very top down. That's not very organic, right?
Yeah, that's very strange. I thought
a lot
of this was emergent, Luddic.
I mean, I've made a lot of these like higher, level comments around this book and the thesis of the book, but I will, this is just the way that I explain things. I will just go through a certain key concept that he uses, like in this book, for the people who are not familiar. I put the meme there in the bottom right corner. That's from the Rick and Morty episode, where the robot says like, what's my purpose? And he says, you spread butter, and the robot is disappointed, right? But here I put in like the WEF guy, and he says, what's my purpose? And he says, you preserve genes. And that's kind of the I mean, if you look at the first chapter in this book that's called, Why Are People? That's sort of the arguments that he puts forward, as that, okay, life basically originates from, like they talk about this primordial soup, basically, that if you introduce like electricity into certain liquids, then that will produce a protein, and that protein can sort of produce a kind of gene, or okay, I'm probably explaining it like slightly wrong, but it is a complicated idea. And over time, like these genes, or they will just find clusters, they find ways to sort of protect themselves by making what he calls a survival machine, where like life forms are basically like sort of what you consider like robots or machines that can protect the genes inside them, right? And that's kind of the entire purpose, or like the entire understanding of life is really like the genes, like the kind of DNA strains that create the phenotypes, like they are immortal. They are what's sort of the center of the universe, basically, and
everything is built around that.
The genes themselves are what's sort of creating the phenotypes, and the phenotypes protect the gene, and they protect them, and they can sort of pass themselves on, and they can reproduce themselves into infinity by creating and discarding these kind of physical, like the sort of physical bodies, basically. I mean, that's sort of it. There's really like there's no room for kind of agency in here. There's no room for will, or he has no interest in like consciousness. He has no interest in taking action, or the organism itself, or the group itself. It's all really about like gene pairs that try to create phenotypes to preserve themselves, and that is sort of, in his view, the correct way to understand how evolution works. So that's sort of, I have a quote here just to, I mean, the chapter is very fascinating to fascinating to read. I'll just read a chapter. I'll read this paragraph here from Why Are People? I think I sent this quote to you earlier, but let's say, okay, quote, we no longer need to resort to superstition when faced with the deep problems. Is there meaning to life? What are we for? What is man? After posing the last of these questions, the eminent zoologist G.G. Simmons put it thus: the point I want to make now is that all attempts to answer that question before 1859 are worthless, and that we will be better off if we ignore them completely. End quote. So it basically says that like everything before the origin of species is just complete crap, completely uninterested in any philosophy that came like, that's older than 150 years.
Yep.
And what basically life is about is like these self-perpetuating strains of information. That's all that there is, really. And I will use game theory and clever, kind of very logically clever assumptions to prove that every attempt that you have to tell me that there's such a thing as altruism, or that it's possible to want to sacrifice yourself, it can be explained away using game theory that I put in. I put programs in my computer that prove that I'm right, and I have these sort of assumptions that that are like smaller than your assumptions, and that's why it's true. So
which is
one of the other
absolutely
concepts,
insane, by the way.
but I mean,
as
a lot of people,
software developer, do not trust the computer ever. For anything.
I mean, that's the thing that a lot of people overlook here, because I mean, he wrote this book in the 70s, and like computers were really cutting edge. Regular people didn't have that. It was only the universities that had access to these mainframes. And I imagine he is sitting there, sitting on the mainframe programming in Pascal and just putting in the numbers that he wants to get, and he gets the numbers that he wants out of them. But now a first year computer science student could make the same thing in a couple of days.
He's running the game of life over and over.
Do the game of life in Java or something. And if you've done these things, and I've done these things, I mean, what you get out of it is what you put into it. If I want a sort of program that proves that I'm right, I can just program that I can put it into the program. The logic itself would just support whatever I want. So I don't find this game theory stuff very convincing. I mean, it's very sophisticated. The problem is that there's no way to actually test it in the real world. Like, you're just creating like this kind of program that's basically supposed to prove
built on models, and further from reality.
So it's supposed to be about like actual physical reality, but the whole thing is just really contained within assumptions and models. Like, you don't, to write the selfish gene, you don't even have to look at animals. You can just sit and read books and sit on your computer and just write. You don't even have to go in a lab or go on an island and look at how animals actually live and make any assumptions. All of this that's in this book could have been written by somebody who's never seen an animal. I mean, I'm not even kidding. Like, you could have just had a book and written all of this stuff. So that's this kind of like weird space that these people, live in. And like, I hope that this clarifies a little bit on how like these sort of new atheists think, and like this insanely kind of reductive worldview that they have, where like basically nothing exists. And they just kind of negate every idea that you put forward, whether it's in sociology or biology, religion, psychology, consciousness. It's all just a sort of epiphenomenon that's like temporary and meaningless. The only thing that matters is like genes that perpetuate themselves. Except for one thing, though, like the last idea that I put in here, which is memetic evolution, where he basically says that along with like genes replicating themselves, you also have ideas as a unit of replication. Meaning that, it's like the game of what's it called, like the whispering game, the game of telephone.
Yeah.
Where ideas can pass on between people, and ideas will also mutate. So an idea is something that can live on forever in the brains of people, basically. And the implication here is, of course, that like memes and genes are like two separate things that don't really need to interface with each other at all. Meaning that like that's where a lot of this this baggage with like the God delusion and why religion is toxic is that religion has nothing to do with the survival of genes. It's just some kind of like mimetic misfiring, or like some sort of mimetic disease that has caught on, that just has nothing to do with the thriving of genes.
My mimetics are more are better than the churches, basically.
Yes, but that's also like where he gets the idea of progressivism. That's like the back door where you could actually still be a progressive, where you can say that you can have cultural evolution in memes. Right, and so it opens up for still being a progressive.
You don't have to deal with all of the uncomfortable stuff that follows with going deep into like gene stuff.
You don't have to deal with like this kind of super social Darwinistic, extremely reductive stuff, because we have memes that just exist separately, and they can just have their own evolution, and that's where we get the lib stuff. But if you look at the next slide, we can go into a bit more of the implication.
I'm gonna real quickly just take a short 30-second break here, just
no
to fill
problem.
my water. You can just keep
I need to
talking.
get some water as well.
Okay. Chat,
break
you
for
have
both.
to entertain yourself for about 30 seconds, and I'll be back.
I feel like a stand-up comedian. I just keep talking and talking. I get so dry in my mouth. Let's see here, 12 people watching. Nordanon asks here, why should life perpetuate itself and why not just die? He doesn't answer that question. He has like no answer for it. He just assumes that that's what's going on. Like life just perpetuates life, and there's no logical reasons why that has to happen, and that's not a question that he is even interested in answering. Because as soon as you get to that point, you're getting more into this kind of metaphysical stuff where like, okay, that's really not what he does at all. He just wants to, talk about the idea that genes are self-replicating and genes can create complexity without a sort of top-down designer, and that can sort of explain away religion and explain away all of these other things. So see here, Bo Gruntman says, they do a similar thing in physics. I heard a physicist put forward that certain things in quantum theory is entirely up to randomness. Total nihilism. I mean, physics is interesting because, there's certain like ideas like quantum physics and the trying to reconcile the kind of Einsteinian physics with quantum physics that actually opens the door for a lot of opportunities in terms of, either, some kind of free will has to exist, or you get the sort of like multiverse theory, or you have like let's say like this view where this sort of observer dominated view where it's really the observer that's kind of creating the world through observation. So I find like of course none of this is integrated with biology. All of the biological theories that exist currently are just completely deterministic in a sort of mechanical way. Let's see, Walrus is back.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you. It is so hot where I live. I'm not sure if you're having a bit of a heat wave.
It's a little bit better here. I mean, it's getting warmer because I have to shut windows to not create too much noise. I live very close to traffic, so that makes it warmer as the further we go. But yeah, I can at least do another hour.
Yeah, I'll be fine. But I'm starting to notice it. I brought a water bottle with me before we started, but I already went through it, and I needed another one because it's not a day for sitting inside on your computer.
Right. So here we go. Like the implications of the of the selfish gene and this kind of gene selection theory that's being proposed. I already covered the idea of the Cartesian split between memes and genes, where they're just like two completely separate things. And the Cartesian split, it comes from Rene Descartes, who basically put forward this sort of like there's a split between like the soul and the body, where you have the body and the physical world that is this completely mechanical deterministic thing, and then human beings also have souls that just live their own life inside of like this mechanistic worldview as a sort of consciousness. So it's like you have like two clocks that are started and are just basically running concurrently, and that's why we experience the world as we do. How these two things interact with each other, he never explained, and that's a lot of if you read some philosophical critiques of Descartes from people who were alive at his time, like this is sort of a question that comes up: is that okay if you have the spirit and you have the body, how can they interface with each other? Like if you say that humans have free will, how is this even possible? And he never actually got around to explaining that. And it's really the same thing like with Dawkins, in my view, that he just sort of separates memes from the genes, and they don't really interface in any way. I mean, he wrote the book that's called The Extended Phenotype later, where he opened up the door for phenotypes interacting with the environment, such as the sort of beaver having a phenotype for building a dam, or like these birds that have a phenotype for building a nest and so on. But it never goes the whole way and just explaining that maybe religion is a part of like a phenotypical progression or a phenotypical trait in human beings. So he just basically keeps on this idea that all religions are mind viruses, as you can see in the God delusion, and they sort of need to be snuffed out to further mimetic evolution. But enough on that point. The other implication then is spontaneous organization, which is really, I mean, at the time that it came in the end of the 70s, this is part of a perfect storm of creating and legitimizing this kind of sort of neoliberal paradigm that they went into. And if you look at or listen to some of the lectures of F.A. Hayek or Milton Friedman, you notice how similar a lot of these things are, how kind of Darwinistic they sound. I mean, are you still there?
Yes, sorry.
Yes.
I was muted.
Okay. Sorry. So, can you click on the kind of Milton Friedman link?
Yes.
Because I really just wanted to show people, if you haven't seen it already, this clip. It's very interesting.
I think I've seen this one before, yeah. Let me bring it up here.
I mean, usually, Gordon Gekko is brought up, but I wanted to bring up
ads?
like I didn't want the straw man, this sort of like movie character. I wanted like the actual academics that espouse this theory. When I grew up in the 2000s, I actually, I was reading about what was going on in the 90s and the 80s with this neoliberalism stuff, and I actually sort of believed that, people didn't take it seriously. Like, well, it's okay. It's like this sort of theoretical thing. They don't actually believe that like the market should just do everything and that everything is going to be solved by like the sort of self-interest. But when you look at how popular this kind of woke stuff is now and how stupid it is, like I actually have gone over to just completely believing that people in the 90s and 80s were completely like sold on this idea that everybody's just going to go around and be super selfish and be as greedy as possible, and that's going to work out to the best for everybody.
Yes.
But yeah, let's listen to Mr. Friedman
question
here.
before this audience is anxious to ask you. When you sit in your study and throughout your career as a professor, you've met students and you've probably dealt with every kind of question, stupid through. I guess I want to know whether you've ever been tempted to become politically revolutionary. Here's my question. When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal.
This is going to be a bit of an aside, but I mean, I'm just so baffled listening to this absolute like abject nonsense from this guy. The first thing I wanted to point out is just how, like, I assume this is on mainstream TV, how you in this time period you could be this cynical in answering that question. I mean, this is something that is not, it's not really happening. I don't see it on TV anymore at all. Like, people who politicians will just come out and just say that, people will talk, oh, there's, the top 1% has too much money. It's like, well, oh, you think everybody's not greedy? Like, aren't you greedy? Everybody's greedy. Come on. I mean, so he's not trying to make appeal to any higher morality at all, Plato did or anything. Like,
he's just saying, well, you would do the same.
we acknowledge that we acknowledge that greed exists, but we don't try to encourage that. Like maybe you have a Christian worldview and you see greed as one of the 7 deadly sins, and we understand that it's there, but we don't want to encourage it. We want to encourage positive, altruistic modes of behavior and not greed. But he'll just sit there. It's like, no, everybody's just fucking greedy. Let's just double down. Let's just lean into the greed. I mean, it is like a level of cynicism that I have a hard time believing that could be on television, considering the world that I've grown up in. The second thing is, of course, the amount of bullshit that's coming out of this guy with the sort of idea that, the only way to get out of poverty is through free markets. I mean, fuck off. Like, Norway was basically got out of poverty because we got money from the United States. It was a geopolitical power move, and they just used that to industrialize the nation to get a more powerful ally. And we found oil, and that's why we're rich. It's not because we had like this hyper free market thing. I mean, FDR with the New Deal, it was basically a dictatorship. Stalinism was like hugely. It was a huge boon for the Russian economy with the industrialization. It was all top down. China has been industrialized sort of like in a very top down fashion. And like these sort of selective examples is like these innovations come from the free market. I mean, most of R&D projects are extremely expensive. Like, you need basically either government to doing it directly or getting government subsidies, because like as Peter Thiel points out in the what's that book called? The Competition is for Losers. I mean, competition does not help innovation. Competition destroys innovation, because when you compete, your margins are basically destroyed. So you're on super low margins.
I'll play the devil's advocate here for a moment, because I see Green River in the chat saying that his higher appeal is liberty, freedom for the individual to be able to act in the market. I'll pull it up here for the video. And wouldn't you say that is true in a vacuum? It is just that he is talking about this in a world where that sort of society won't exist.
Yeah, that's the problem with these people, is that
it's like he's trying to channel Adam Smith in the current world.
I think Hayek
but it's
is
not even
better
close to the same society.
I mean, Hayek is better on this, and we have another clip of him as well. Like, and he explains it as we have this. We're going to have to use from these super large scale societies. We need to use signals basically to organize these societies, and profit is a kind of signal that can be used to guide the society, instead of people locally and acting out of altruism, acting out of care for the immediate of kin. When the society is like so massive, you need basically to have this abstraction of the liberal economy to make it work. And I understand that, but his model of thinking basically, it ignores geopolitics completely. It ignores politics as a general rule, where it's like that they are describing a world where politics don't exist, right? That's really the world.
That's what I'm saying.
It presupposes that politics has happened, that politics must have created like this frame where you can have a market economy, but then politics just stops and the market just takes over, right? That's sort of what's assumed here. But politics never stops. It's always going to be an integral part of what's profitable and what's not profitable. And I totally agree.
I've struggled with. In the past few years, or I suppose we're talking a longer time, I suppose part of my journey from libertarianism to where I am now has been the idea that all of these Austrian economic models make sense, but as long as there is politics, they're going to be interfered with. So then what's the point? Right?
Yeah, I mean,
my models can be perfect, and my idea for an ideal society can be perfect, but if the world I live in is never gonna look like that, what am I gonna do? Right?
I agree with the idea that, I mean, you want an economy that is smooth and that is sort of self-sustaining, and that where political interference is as minimal as possible.
Even looking aside, taking aside the economy, just somewhere, where you have actual liberty.
Yes, I agree. and liberty is one thing, but you have to ask, like, what is liberty for, right?
Yeah. What is
Is
freedom?
liberty
And,
you have liberty to just be as greedy as possible, right? Or do you have it
Yeah.
because you want to live some kind of authentic religious
is
life,
it,
right?
Freedom to indulge, or is it freedom from sin? And there you go, right?
Yeah, that's the point of what is the freedom for. And I agree that you should have effective economies and set it up in the way that you actually reward people who are working hard and who are making good decisions. They should always be rewarded. I completely agree. And everything being equal, that's what should happen. I mean, I'm kind of a fan of places like Singapore, for instance, that have like a very sort of free market economy. But you realize that there has to be stuff around that. There has to be geopolitics and all of these other things that are much better, in my view, lenses of understanding and explaining the world and of making policies than just looking at the economic factors. I mean, say stuff like, I mean, you have this worldview that he has, and you look at something like these modern tech businesses, like the Airbnbs or like the Ubers. I mean, these companies are like the logic that he presents. It doesn't apply here, because these companies are basically funded through SoftBank with like Saudi Arabian money. It has to be understood as like this geopolitical power move from like the Saudi family trying to get a foothold into the market.
Well, I mean, that's the point,
like
though, right? The theoretical that the libertarian is arguing for or even from is so far removed from where we're at today that it's almost useless to talk about it. Because
I mean, using it is just distorting, because you're attributing things that are actually geopolitical and political things to the spontaneous economics. Like things that are actually top-down decisions are being attributed as being bottom-up when you think this way, right? And it's just legitimizing things that are actually policy, or things that are actually sort of planned events, like say like cultural change that let's say like things like hookup culture, or things like this, like the tranny stuff. Someone like him would just justify that as like, this is like market demand. It's market demand that sort of drives the increase in trannies on Netflix or something like that, if you believe what he believes in. But I assume that people in this sphere knows that it's really a little bit far from the truth. There's other things at work there, and that's usually what happens. What I find in most of the cases, even though I would like to live in this world where like the stuff that's happening is actually a result of genuine demand and not some kind of geopolitical plot. But anyway,
once you get to that stage, all of these theories can apply. But until you get to that stage, then, it's just a theory.
But of course, it wasn't theoretical in the 80s and the 90s, because you had people like Thatcher and Reagan basically coming out and saying that, here's road to serfdom, like this is what we believe in, this is what we're going to implement.
Well, sure.
Like,
I mean, but the world they lived in and the world we live in still doesn't work like that, right?
No, I agree. But of course, this has been like sounds like it's been like a very big segue. The point is that like this kind of thinking is really completely in line with this sort of selfish gene thinking.
Oh yeah.
The kind of Darwinism that comes out of that it's it just legit, because that came out in the 70s. And a lot of this policy was implemented in the 80s. So, I mean, you look to the economists and they're saying this thing, and you look to the biology, and what's biology saying? It's saying the exact same thing. Like, it's just kind of backing
it all
up.
fits.
It all fits, right? I mean, we're just doing what's natural here. So there's a reason why, like, these kind of ideas, I believe, had so much legitimacy in that time, because the biology, like the cutting edge biology, basically said the exact same thing. And if you go back to the presentation again, we could look at another example. If you look at the guys on the right there, the most leftward guy, his name is Jeffrey Skilling, and he was the working CEO of Enron, the Enron Corporation. That it was basically founded in 1985 as a sort of corporate merger between two energy companies by Kenneth Lay, and it went bankrupt in 2001. It's basically the biggest corporate scandal in the history of corporate scandals. I mean, we're talking like absolute murder here, where this is a sort of business that we're using a lot of fake fake accounting tricks on the one hand by basically writing down profits that they didn't make and reporting that to the investors and making people sort of invest their entire fortune into this sort of fake company, and they were hiding their debt by moving their debts away from the company into these sort of like shell companies that existed underneath Enron. And of course, the politics and the sort of philosophy inside of the company was just pure Darwinianism. Like Jeffrey Skilling has come out and said that like the selfish gene, that was basically his Bible. That's like the favorite book that he had, and the, the policies, the sort of approach that he had to life is basically, it's completely consistent with that book. And of course, Dawkins will go out and say that's where the is ought comes in, right? Yeah. Is ought stuff like, okay, just because biology is like that doesn't mean we should be like that, but he doesn't actually give a good reason why.
And that's how you can be a lefty and still write that book.
you can still be a lefty and write that book. But I mean, this is like, I mean, to understand like the scope and scale of this, because it's really funny to read and watch documentaries about corporate scandals. There's a movie that's called The Smartest Guys in the Room, for people who are interested and who have time. That covers like the entire Enron thing. I mean, it's a blast to watch. I mean, even though like this is like, I look at this as completely horrible, selfish crap, it sounds like they had fun inside of the company.
If you want to watch like the hyper reality version of this, you can just watch Wall Street, the movie.
Yeah, it's like Wolf of Wall Street, but it's like it's almost even worse.
But just the Gordon Gekko one, or Wolf of Wall Street, the modern one.
I mean, with these guys, it went so far to the point that they included basically stock trading as a part of their business model, right? Where they were basically trading futures on stuff like energy and weather. And
as
they
part
were
of their business.
As part of their business model, yeah.
Nice.
And to beat their own markets, they basically bought the right to like California and other states, like the power grids of those states. So they would manipulate the amount of power that would go out to basically beat the markets. so like you're talking about a corporation that is turning on and off the entire power supply of massive states. Like California is like one of the biggest economies, in the world. And they were just, owning their power grid, turning it on and off to make money, which basically means that you have people in hospitals and people who need like power constantly who would probably have died during it. Like it's not really, there's no good record of how much damage they did doing this stuff. But they were doing that. They had connections to like George Bush Jr., who basically like he refused to do anything about him because he knew a lot of the people in the top leadership and so on. But it's really like
why a lot of movies from like the 80s and 90s have like cyberpunk themes, right?
Yes. But I mean, you see this kind of like corporate fraud atmosphere that started to bubble up through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I wonder how much of that was influenced by the combination of this kind of Hayek economics with the kind of selfish gene biology. I added in a fun one here as well. Like you had Newt Gingrich, which I assume people are familiar with. There's an article there that's called the Chimpanzee Politics, which now we're moving a little bit away from Dawkins himself and into like this biologist from Netherlands called Frans de Waal. And I think Jordan Peterson very recently had an interview with him. He talked about like how influential he had been, but Frans de Waal was also one of these zoologists who were operating at the time, and he didn't contribute to the kind of selfish gene framework in any sense, but he was a part of popularizing this kind of return to monkey thinking, right? And that's what this article.
Absolutely horrible photo. Sorry, and this is a portrait interview of this guy.
Well, it is from like this kind of lefty, this very pessimistic angle, but he sort of entails that because of the influences at the time, like Newt Gingrich is basically like the reason why American politics is a shit show, because he sort of just looked at these books about like chimpanzee politics, the selfish gene and so on, and said that like we can't just like do politics the old way. We have to get back to nature. We have to get back to like this Second Circuit dominating, pissing and shitting on each other style of politics. So he just changed out the Republican Party. He brought in younger guys and he made it he basically made it more combative. Like that's one of the reasons that people look at American politics and they like it is just like the shit flinger contest, and they look at it as like this is primitive. Like they're like, us Europeans, we're very enlightened. Well, the Americans are like, they're like these dumb backwards people, but it's actually the opposite. Like, I mean, the decisions to make their both the politics and the kind of corporate environment into this kind of social Darwinist monkey flinger hellholes is actually based on science. It's based on like the cutting edge of what came out in biology at the time. So they're actually ahead of us. They're not behind us just because we're doing it the same way they did in the 60s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Jesus. I think that covers that. If we go to the next slide here, we can start taking the piss out of Dawkins a little bit.
Let's go.
There's an article there with his political views. You could look at that.
Find that
sort
one.
of, so we could go pick some of those things apart.
Is this the Wikipedia thing?
Yeah.
Political affiliation: Labour Party, Lib Dems.
You're not sharing.
Oh, sorry.
You're not sharing with us.
I wanted to keep this for myself, apparently. Let's see here.
You have to narrate. So, I mean, here you go with he's just like this kind of like basic bitch, Labour Party, social democrats person, like who he was first in like the sort of Labour, then he went to the Liberal Democrats. So like he has a lot of this kind of standard old school leftist views where it's like freedom of speech, of course, which is of course usually with a caveat that there are certain things that you're not supposed to talk about. So we then feminists and women's rights, no surprise there. So that's one of the things that he, the reasons that he goes after religion. Elevator Gate came up with like this.
What the hell is this?
I mean, this is like one of these sort of new atheist drama sessions, right? Where they had like a sort of conference for these kind of new atheist influencers in, I think it was in like the 2010s, and Rebecca Watson is one of these new atheist content creators. And what happened is that she got stuck in an elevator with another guy from that conference, and he asked her if she wanted to go back to his room.
Tipped his fedora at her
to have a coffee, and then she had like a speech the next day about this is unacceptable. Basically, you should never, like if you're in the elevator with a woman that she's like trapped, you should never try to make advances and such. And this became like a gigantic thing. Like this is when the split started to happen in the atheist community, where you split up the plus people and the kind of just the standard anti-SJW crowd. And Richard Dawkins kind of piled on the SJW stuff, where he said that, what about the Muslim women, right? I mean, you're complaining, but what about the Muslims' rights? And of course,
I remember. The name now as like the thing that started Atheism Plus, but I wasn't aware of the details.
It wasn't just her. Like LGBT issues is one of the things that and abortion and animal rights. This is one of the like the biggest gotcha things that when you look at his worldview and how like contradictory and retarded it is. Where Dawkins. Quote, Dawkins strongly argues for a genetic basis for homosexuality and postulates that the gene was preserved through various social and cultural processes. This is interesting because, like, from this kind of selfish gene perspective, how do you explain homosexuality? How do you do
what's
it?
What's the preservation?
It's just not possible. And like, there's a video that I linked in the presentation where he comes up with like 3 explanations for it, all of which suck. But this is something you can't explain. Like if you believe in group selection, you can explain that. You can sort of say that it would be an asset for a group to have maybe some males who are kind of asexual or homosexual, who are like completely focused on some type of innovation or just being warriors or something like that. So you get an Alan Turing occasionally, you get a Leonardo da Vinci or sort of Peter Thiel on occasion, and that could be sort of a boon for like the group who has those individuals. Is going to do better than those who don't have them. But that's only
eunuchs who can devote their life to something.
Yes, that's only if you believe in group selection, and he doesn't. So if you only believe that it's only the gene that tries to maximize itself, and the gene itself is not interested in procreation, how the hell has this like gene existed? Well, I don't believe it's a gene at all, really. But like The question is first, okay, why does this have to be genetic? Because there's no like good scientific support for homosexuality being a genetic thing. That's one. So if the science is not supporting him, why does he keep holding on to it? And the second thing is that, okay, if this is true, how can his worldview actually defend it, which it can't. So this is like this sort of cognitive dissonance stuff that he gets so deeply into when he tries to do anything outside of just explaining why nothing matters, and we're all just kind of like these genes living in survival machines. Like, you try to take that framework and go outside and explain something else, and you just tie yourself in knots.
Yeah, whenever he's not talking about his computer models, it all falls apart.
No, he can't really. He doesn't have anything to lean on to explain, like, okay, why does this happen? I mean, even like his humanism, because that's a part of his political views. Like, he's a humanist, and he won the Humanist of the Year award, which he was canceled later because he made some disparaging comments about like gender science, right? But the Christians are still a problem, right? But I mean, with this guy, he can't even define what a human is, because he's very like much in this sort of animal rights activists who sort of believe that, like, okay, animals are equal to human beings because they have nervous systems and they share genes. So what exactly is special about a human? Like, if you're a humanist, then you derive your morals from a human being, and you can't define what a human being is. Like, I mean, like, he's in such like absolute knots in trying to explain anything else. If you go back to the slides again, I can try to go through the points to explain myself a bit more coherently here. I'm just going to go through the bullet points as I remember them. It's like the fuzzy logic and the Boolean logic thing, where he's very selective in basically when he will allow people to apply some kind of fuzzy logic. I mean, for those who are not familiar, the Boolean logic is really the true or false. Like, something can either be true or it can be false. And the fuzzy logic is that if you have some values in between, like you have the kind of spectrum of truth. Let's say that something could be like 70% true. Both of these terms are used in computer science, but they apply very much in this context. So let's take the sort of famous interview where he dunks on Bill O'Reilly, right? Where they talk about religion, and Bill O'Reilly says that, religion, like, it's true for me, right? It's in my world that's true, and he just he spurgs out, basically. Dawkins spurgs out and like, oh, it has to be true. What do you mean true for you? It has to be true. It's either true or is it not true? And he will just push a lot of these theists and a lot of these like low IQ Christian people that he debates into. It's an either or, basically. It's not a spectrum. Like, you have to either fully believe in this thing or fully believe in that thing,
right?
Which he will completely abandon when it comes to the question of abortion, for instance. Like, is something a human or is it not a human? Well, then he will apply.
I remember he got into like trouble for saying you should abort babies that have like Down
because
syndrome.
they're not human, basically. So let's say the next point, biological chauvinism, is that he seems to think that, like, his science, it's like that's the be all end all of anything, and he has like no interest or patience for anything else. Like, I think he has one of these tweets where he says, continental philosophy. Is truth regional now? It's like, truth, does that belong to the continent? It's like, this is like Scottish mathematics or something. Like, he just has no patience or understanding for anything else, and like his like this kind of super deterministic model for it, and which goes into the next point. That's this kind of like reductio absurdum, Occam's razor point, where everything just has to be reduced to the absolute simplest form, and there's no room for like these larger, more comprehensive models. I mean, like these, in the debates that you see with a lot of these new atheists, you hear the slippery slope being used a lot, right? This kind of, it's a slippery slope fallacy. But there's another fallacy that's called the continuum fallacy. That's kind of like the opposite of the slippery slope. That really goes in like, I can explain it like this. Let's say, I mean, you have like a pile of pebbles, and there's 1,000 pebbles in that pile, and I remove one pebble, and I say to you that it's still a pile, right? So it's 999 pebbles, and I remove another pile. So removing one more is not going to. It's still going to be a pile, and I can just keep removing pebbles from the pile, but eventually, it's not a pile anymore, right? Eventually, it's just
a rock.
Yeah, it's just one pebble, or it's
pebble,
nothing.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of fallacy that they end up falling into with this sort of reducto absurdism, where, like, say, like with the abortion question, I mean, at some point, you know, if you keep adding cells
But
to the
that's what
embryo,
I'm saying.
right?
Like whenever you remove these assumptions and using this as sort of the measuring stick for which one is more right, the negative space that you're leaving behind, you know, that might be what made the pile a pile, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so they will just completely like chop away at all kinds of constructs until there's really nothing left, and you're sitting there like a kind of gimp. So I've covered some of these other points, like the hard determinism and the naturalism, where, I mean, there's really no room for conscious actors in his models at all. There's no room for consciousness, even though he believes that we are conscious and that we have consciousness. It doesn't fit into his model. It can't. He can only explain it in terms of like, well, evolutionarily being conscious is better than not being conscious, and that's why we're conscious. But it doesn't really explain anything. You know, it doesn't really tell you where it comes from or how it's connected to biology or like the mind-body problem. Completely uninterested in that. The unconscious cultural bias I've already talked about, like the sort of like so much of what he believes in is just like this ad hoc justification for this British liberalism. Whig history, of course. I mean, you know, he doesn't even care about things that happened before 1859.
Yeah.
And now we can look at this sort of video where he tries to explain. This is a funny one. He tries to explain to a gay guy where gays come from in his view. If you click on the URL there, it's this little YouTube video.
Yep. I got like a second of it, and I was reminded on how obnoxious his style is. Let's try this.
Three, I suppose, possibilities. One is the so-called gay uncle theory, where you look after your nephews and nieces or other relatives, and that makes sense in a wild, ancestral human where perhaps the sort of butch men went out hunting and left their children in the charge of not only the mothers but also uncles. I mean, maybe the brothers of the so that means that the gay gene was passed on in the bodies of the children who were being protected by the gay uncles. So that's one possibility.
Right, and that's one that makes a lot of sense, and I think that I think it does explain why the gay gene was passed on. And I think there's a lot more we're going to learn about that.
Did I lose my connection
there? The so-called sneaky fucker.
I haven't heard you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe I got muted. Okay, so we'll look at the first theory here. So he says that, okay, in the ancestral environment, right, the gays would have stayed home to protect the kids.
Yep.
Of the straight men, right? Say if I had a brother and he was gay, and I go out hunting and he stays behind to protect my children, and then the gay gene is passed on.
Which is a fucking weird, yeah.
I mean, where in the children is that gene passed on? In the assholes of these children? I mean, he doesn't really explain how that even works. I mean, they're still not breeding. Okay, so that's one of the things. Like, okay,
maybe
they're watching.
The gay gene is latent in the father, like the guy who actually has kids' DNA. I don't know what his theory is.
How does that work? That doesn't work.
But
with
also,
this theory,
as
right?
you said, this doesn't work if the gene is selfish. Right?
No, if gene is selfish, it doesn't work. Like, it's only the ones who breed, and it's only going to be the straight brother who breeds, and not the gay uncle. And even if its kids survive or not, they survive with the genes of the straight man, so it doesn't work. And the other sort of what you call fallacy here is to assume that the gay men are feminine, which is pretty ridiculous in my view. Like, to ancestral gay men are like these kind of smell the flowers, these kind of like fashion designers. Like, I think of usually like
very
these
homophobic of Richard.
It's kind of like hyper masculine men, you know, like it's kind of like Fleece Johnson, like these people in jail who rape each other and stuff. Like, I would imagine like these people would be gladiators, like these hyper sexualized, you know, dominating other men with anal sex and so on. Like, and so he's basically assuming that, but I'm serious.
I agree.
You know,
I'm just joking.
I think that's a much more plausible, you know, gay person who lived in the medieval era than someone who is like a little flower child, you know, it's like this very sensitive man who
The flower child would
wants
probably
to,
just be bullied or killed.
he would be bullied
Yeah.
or killed or something, and like,
Stunned,
I mean,
yeah.
this explanation, he's not breeding anyway, so it doesn't matter. So okay, first one debunked.
Right.
Let's look at the second one. Roll the tape.
which is the idea that the males who possess the gay gene, many of them may not have been wholly homosexual, they may have been bisexual. Now, in that case, again, go back to our scenario of the dominant males going off hunting and leaving behind the women and children in the charge.
Again, why, if your brother, right? I mean, your brother is a bit strange, right? He's a bit touchy-feely, right? But I mean, you're still going to take him hunting if he's capable. Or are you going to leave him behind? I mean, he's got to be quite a weakling if you don't want to take him hunting.
He assumes the same idea that you're talking about, like a very effeminate gay person, which is not accurate at all with most of the gays. Honestly, it's just like this kind of image that they've put in media.
He's theorizing about like his strange assumption here.
Yes, but let's finish this theory here. So I'll tear this one apart as well.
Males. And if there were other males who were known to be homosexual, then the dominant males would have trusted them not to mate with the females. I mean, we're imagining a situation in which the dominant males are very possessive about their females, perhaps harem holders. And so being gay would have been a pretty good certificate that you can safely leave your women with me. Now, if they were bisexual, that would have been a false assumption. And once again, we now have a way in which the gay gene could have been passed on.
Right, I mean, it does make sense.
Okay. Stop. So he's
This
basically
does not
assuming
make sense. You made like a fucking roller coaster to like a Rube Goldberg machine to get your logic through all of these hoops.
So the core of the argument here is that gay men are not actually gay; they're actually bisexual, and they use the gayness as a sort of camouflage tactic.
That's
to
very
fuck women,
homophobic of you,
basically.
Richard.
Yeah. No, but, I mean, like, yeah. So apparently, this is a thing that happens, right? When your girlfriend has like a gay friend, and he's actually not really gay; he's just pretending to be gay to fuck your girlfriend. So the kid that you had is actually from the gay man. I mean, is this something that's known to happen? This sounds extremely far fetched. I mean, I've never heard of that. I mean, usually the gays are like, gay men are very exclusively gay. I mean, you have a lot of female bisexuals who have like flexible sexuality, but like, hard gay men are usually like very gay. They're not like, oh, I'm just pretending to be like this sensitive hair designer to fuck your wife, and she probably wouldn't want to do that anyway. I mean, if your wife is letting her guard down, it's because she doesn't perceive him as being a mate, basically, and then he's just going to turn that around. It's just like, oh, surprise, I was straight the whole time, you want to fuck me now, right? She's not going to say that.
And that's like not going to work. If he rapes her, then she's going to tell you when you get back, and then
she's just going to tell the dominant.
In this universe, this guy is a weakling, so you're just going to beat him.
Yeah, I mean, how are the men not going to know about that? You know, the gay man just turns around, rapes your wife, and then the straight men come home and they hear about that. They're just going to smash this guy into the rocks, and they're going to throw his baby into the lions, right? So it doesn't work. It's another just complete, like you said, Rube Goldberg machine of an ad hoc justification for why he has to have this kind of like gay gene view of it, which justifies rights for gay people, because it's like, now it's kind of you can't do anything about it. It's not something you're choosing. It's something that even though scientific consensus doesn't even support it, but he has to like ad hoc support his like basic bitch 70s liberalism, right? So I mean, you see, like, it's very hard to look at this clip and think that this is like not just like sublimated psychology from this guy, and like take him seriously as like this theorizer. But okay, let's hear the third option.
Sense in that way, because they could go off and be more trusting, and we see that today where straight friends just love that they won't let their wives hang out with other straight guys, and they get too close. But if you're gay, oh, it's great, go out and have a good time, and it doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, because if you're gay, you're in my experience, and as far as I know, everyone I've talked to would say that gay men are very exclusively
Certainly.
gay. I mean, yeah.
That
jealousy. Exactly.
Yes. So that definitely makes sense, both historically and also contemporarily.
Well, now,
I mean, it's hard, and it seems like it would make a lot of sense. It's hardly a good gay rights slogan.
No,
but,
that's right.
But
No,
it
that's
actually
right.
is. It does make sense from a biological.
But I mean, you see that the way the argument's going, obviously, that it could be that that males in our wild ancestors who possessed the gay gene, that they got their genes into the next generation by using that strategy. And being gay was, or at least being bisexual, being gay was a very convincing way of lulling the suspicions of the dominant males.
That's interesting. The question
Stop
with that
it.
theory remains.
Yeah, I mean,
What?
you're watching this guy like basically doing another guy in the ass. I'm lulling the suspicions, guys. You know, this is not suspect at all. Like you have this.
Doing
Like,
the long con, yeah.
I can't do the long game. I can't imagine anything that would make you more suspicious than being gay in a small tribal society. Like, I mean, you would want to hide that, right? I mean, that would make you extremely suspicious. You're sort of assuming that like this tribal society is liberal. Like they would just be fine with this guy being gay. They would just accept it and just allow him to do the hair of the women and plant flowers and so on, which is just projecting. But we have one more theory.
I don't see why being gay would exempt you from every other rule that exists in this theoretical ancient society.
No, exactly. It's there's so many questions there, right?
For today, though, if people were doing that back then, and then in more modern terms, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we had people pressured into getting married and reproducing with their genes. What happens for the next few generations when gay people are just simply coming out and they're not having sex with the opposite sex? Are we going to see a decrease in homosexuality?
Well, we might do, I suppose, on that theory, but it would probably take longer than the couple of decades.
Yeah, I wish.
I was going to
wish,
say
pal,
you
it's
were
kinda-
proven
it's kinda
wrong
the-
on that one, Richard. I'm
Kind of
sorry.
it's kind of the opposite that's happening. Like you've allowed these people to just go and fuck each other, and they're just more gays than ever. So
Yep.
that's kind of wrong. Like even though I mean some of them are using surrogates, but the majority of them are not breeding, but it's still an increase in both like gay, trans, lesbian, all of them. So yeah, hypothesis destroyed.
With now, so I think perhaps a more serious objection might be. I don't know what percentage of men are bisexual as opposed to purely homosexual.
Right.
And perhaps
I'm getting suspicious of Dawkins.
Of course you don't know because you're making it up. You're making it
Well,
up,
not
Dawkins.
just
You're just
that,
pulling it out of your ass. Yeah.
Do you have questions, Dawkins? It's okay.
Could you please
sorry.
tell me how many men are homosexual, bisexual, especially younger men who would be discreet, if it would be possible to tell me?
you know that.
I don't know that, but it seems to me that there were a lot more women that are bisexual. I can't think of really too many guys. They start out as bisexual, and they usually come out as gay later. Now, there are men who are...
See, even this gay guy is like, no, usually guys gay guys are hardcore gay.
Local expert.
Local expert.
bisexual. But I just think it's a smaller percentage than people might think, just from my experience having being in the gay community and running organizations or meeting thousands of people over the years. I can't think of too many people that hop back and forth.
No. And you couldn't imagine yourself. I mean, you couldn't imagine being bisexual.
Not in my wildest dreams, I couldn't imagine that. And if I would, I'd be happy, although it would be quite distracting.
This guy is dick only, guys. It's,
I like this kind of caption, the translation. He says like "not in my wildest dreams," but it was translated into "not in my wildest jeans," which is just weirdly appropriate for
a Freudian slip.
conversation. Yeah.
Imagine that. And if I would, I'd be happy, although it would be quite distracting. But it's just something I could not imagine.
Right. Okay. And the third theory that I suggest is a
Here
rather
we go.
more esoteric one, is that when we talk about a gene for something or other, a gene for anything, a gene for X, a gene for being aggressive, a gene for having blue eyes, a gene for being gay, it doesn't always have to be a gene for that thing. It's a gene for that thing under the right environmental conditions. So, for example, the gay gene that manifests itself now in an urban environment in homosexual tendencies might, in a very different environment out on the African plains.
Is he making the mouse utopia experiment argument?
No, he's basically
think that-
appealing to epigenetics, right?
Yeah, but he's saying
which
that
he
if
thinks
you
is,
if you give the rats everything they want, some of them are going to turn into the beautiful ones.
No, he comes like you can listen a little bit further because he
All right.
explains, he elaborates a little bit more on.
Yeah,
on
let's let him finish. Let him finish. Yeah.
In homosexual tendencies might, in a very different environment out on the African plains, have manifest itself in another way. Genes are not that deterministic. They can show themselves in one way under one environmental circumstance, in a different way under another one. So just as an example of that, suppose that bottle feeding is the environment, this is a purely hypothetical thing, suppose bottle feeding is the environmental circumstance that means that the gay gene manifests itself in gay behavior. But if you're breastfed, and please don't imagine I think that's true, it's just an example. But if you're breastfed, it doesn't. Well, before bottles were invented, that means that the gay gene would never have manifested itself in gay behavior at all. It would have manifested itself as something quite different. I mean, maybe the ability to be good at tracking animal prey or something of that sort. Once bottle feeding came in, it changes the manifestation of the gene. So what this theory is saying is that there's really no such thing as the gay gene. There's the gay gene given that the cultural or environmental.
Okay, so he's saying that the makeup of the environment today emerges the gay gene.
Yeah, I mean, if you're saying bottle feeding, which is interesting because I mean the Bible talks about gays, and there wasn't a lot of bottles around then. I mean, I think the history of like gays has been like as long as recorded history. I think there's been.
He's using it as an example.
I get it, but it's just kind of silly, isn't it? But like he says, like it's the modern environment that has some epigenetic effect, which I mean, it's not the modern environment because gays have been around for like as long as anything has been around, right? So that doesn't make sense. There's no new thing that's triggering this. So like it's some other epigenetic thing. But the thing is that this guy will talk about epigenetics as pseudoscience. Like he talks about like,
right.
That's just kind of ruining his theory of gene selection that's deterministic. I mean, he flips back and forth on this stuff. But again, it doesn't explain it. I mean, if let's say you have a gene that will express itself as gay in certain circumstances. Okay, why? Why is that beneficial? Why has that gene survived? It doesn't make sense. Even though it's like, okay, you can turn it on and off with stimuli. Well, it's still not a benefit. Like it's still a liability, even though you turn it on and off. So I don't understand how this explains anything. It's just, okay, epigenetics exists. Okay, what then? I mean, even from the selfish perspective, that doesn't make any sense. So there are three arguments that he just pulls out of his ass and he's just like making up on the fly. And like this is... But there are other videos where he's like repeating it, so he's apparently kind of proud that he came up with these arguments. Although you can see how slippery this is, right?
Yeah, it's
this
very,
is like
very rickety.
He's very smart and he's very articulate. And for some from midwit who's listening to this is going to think that like this is very credible. This is like a really credible idea. But if you're a little bit suspicious and you start to break down the assumptions that go into what he's saying, it doesn't make sense at all. He's just like making it up.
Yeah.
As he's going along.
He's even got a perfect scholar steeple going on in the picture here. Yeah. He's practiced that for a long time.
It's very the steeple. It makes you unlikable, but it makes you look smart, right?
Yes.
That's the. I mean, if you want to look smart, you have to walk around like that. That's what I learned.
That's true.
But people won't like you.
I'm going to start just walking around like that.
Oh boy. Well, okay. The last fun one: why being vegan is rational from an evolutionary perspective. And if you thought like the gay one was like bullshitty, we can have some fun with this one.
Oh, this is from Big Think.
Yeah, Micro Think.
Minus 25% på det fine hårprodukter.
I don't have ads on. I don't understand. I think it turns off something when I go into like private browsing. It turns off like my ad blocker.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have the extensions are connected to your Google account, right? So
yeah.
So we get to see some Norwegian ads.
Yeah, wow. All right.
Big brain. Let's go.
Science is not in the business of shedding light on moral debates, but I think it can do sometimes. The whole subject of moral philosophy, of examining moral questions in a logical way to expose inconsistencies, for example. When you're looking at moral questions, so-called moral questions like abortion or euthanasia, you can show that people who take a very strong absolutist line may be being inconsistent with themselves because they are taking a strong line on one thing while at the same time inconsistently not taking a similarly strong line on another. So that would be a scientific way of thinking. It's not science per se, it's moral philosophy, but it's a kind of scientific way of thinking. But also I think scientific facts can illuminate moral debate. In the case of abortion, again, for example, a scientist might contribute to the debate information about at what point during the development of an embryo the nervous system comes into being. And presumably before the nervous system comes into existence, there is no ability to feel pain or to suffer. And so maybe something important happens at the moment when the nervous system comes into being. On the other hand, you might say, well, even when a human embryo develops a nervous system and develops the capacity to perhaps suffer, it's still a much smaller nervous system than the nervous system of an adult cow. And so what about balancing the suffering of a human embryo against the suffering of an adult cow when it's being slaughtered for meat? An absolutist moralist would say, well, humans are just plain special, and cows are not human, so they don't deserve the same.
Based.
Well, yeah, they are. I mean, if you just he'll elaborate a little bit more on this point, but he digs himself even further in. But of course, okay, let him talk a little bit more. I'm just good, so I'll give.
But a scientist might come along and say, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, we are, after all evolved. We're all cousins. At what point in the evolution of, since we know evolution is a fact, at what point in the evolution of humans would you suddenly draw the line and say, right, from now on they're all human, and before that they're not? In the evolutionary progression from the common ancestor with chimpanzees, who lived about 6 or 7 million years ago, to modern humans, going through creatures which might have looked a bit like Lucy, might have looked a bit like the newly discovered fossil Ardi, would you have given special human, moral, ethical consideration to Lucy, or would you count Lucy?
I mean, now he's just covering the whole, like, should the lion kill the zebra? Because they're...
Yeah, that's but this is like different in this sense, because now he's almost making the opposite argument here, is that we should give considerations to animals because they have like similar genes, and okay,
Yeah.
oh, well, what makes humans special?
Yeah.
What makes humans special? Like, this is like this kind of dishonest bullshit tactic that this I mean, of course, in the Christian worldview, right? Man has dominion over the animals. That's just in the Bible. That's just nothing to discuss, right? But okay. How many biology textbooks have cows written? You know, like, I mean, how many chimpanzees have like sent a rocket into space? Like, okay, and do you not know the fucking difference between a monkey and a human being? Like, do you want to give a monkey a social security number, like maybe the right to vote or something like that? And why not? Okay, what's his argument? Let's say I want to put like Caligula. Caligula. I want to put my horse in the Senate. You know what? There's no difference. Like, we have a common ancestor, right? I mean, the horse has a perspective and a nervous system. So, of course. Of course, we need to give ethical consideration. Of course, we know we don't have to do that. Of course, we can, say that humans are basically prime, like we're more important than the animals, and they exist to serve us. There's nothing inconsistent with that. Just because we have like this is this sort of is-ought fallacy again. Like, just because we have a common gene with a what do you say, with a cow, does that mean that we shouldn't slaughter a cow? Right? I mean, this is it's really the opposite argument that he made against group selection. Now he's almost making like a pro-group argument here. So he's completely inconsistent with these things. And with the abortion stuff, it's really like, okay, you want to give more consideration to a cow because it has a bigger nervous system. What are you talking about? Like, this is, let's say, I mean, if you're talking about genetic relatedness, a human fetus, let's say like someone in my local community has an abortion, that is like almost, genetically a clone of me, even though it's not my child or it's not,
Yeah.
it's so close to me that it's almost my clone. It could have just be me basically, but the cow is just like way out there. So it's okay to kill like the fetus because for some reason, because that it doesn't matter that it's genetically basically my clone. And like, that's an argument from like this evolutionary theory that you should care more about the fetus because it's basically a clone of you instead of caring about the cow. So the cow exists basically to chew food. Like that's what these animals do. They just, instead of us having to chew the grass, they can chew the grass. We eat them, and we can spend less time eating food. Just like the sort of aristocrats, this kind of like what do you call these people who came out of the mountains? The sort of paleo, the pastoral peoples, right? The sort of pastoral people, the original aristocrats who were able to dominate, the kind of European continent because they were meat eaters, right? They had to spend less time eating. They were healthier. So because the cow has done that work for them, and now they can just spend less time eating with less of these kind of allergies and all this stuff coming in with the prepared meat, and spend more time on intellectual work. And that's the role of the cow. I mean, and of course you can make the argument that you should try to treat them a little bit more humanely, or treating them, you don't have to be grotesque in how you slaughter them, but the idea that
circle of life part, right?
Yes, but the idea that you're not going to slaughter the cow because you have a common gene, I mean, it's completely bizarre. And I go back to the sort of humanism thing again as well. But it's like he says, oh, you do want to give humans special consideration. You're a humanist. Hey, Dawkins. You're a fucking humanist. Like, what is if you can't explain what a human is, and you can't like tell a dividing line between what like a chimpanzee and a cow and a human?
There's a cow
humanist. How do you like create a morality out of human potential if you can't even create like a clear definition of what that is? So it's like this. It's just so riddled with contradictions. But on the video itself, you can see the like and dislike ratio, and that's just like. There's almost nobody disliking it. It's like this is like considered very smart, like this very
they don't show that anymore.
Progressive perspective, right? But you can get the extension, right? And that's why I have it on my browser, so you can see it's very popular. And this is considered like big brain stuff, even though it's like completely retarded. And the only way I can explain it is that this guy has built up so much clout that he just has these nut huggers that will just buy like everything he says. Regardless if it's consistent or not, right? They're not completely, they just turn their brains off and just eat up all the kind of slop that he serves. So now we've spent enough time on him. We could, I put this one in here as well. I mean, we've covered a lot of this stuff already, but I thought it was sort of fun.
I think we've talked about all of this throughout
this thing, and like here we have like Dawkins, his sort of assumptions. There's no God, there's no altruism, no objective morality, no man-animal distinction. And like you saw the previous video, that's why I put this in here, because he can't make a clear distinction between a man and an animal. We have Dennett here, which is his sort of philosophy of explaining consciousness. There's no mind, there's no consciousness, there's no qualia. I mean, you have videos of him saying that basically he doesn't want to use the word qualia. He thinks it's a meaningless concept. And you have the enlightened centrist here, Sam Harris. He doesn't believe in free will. He doesn't believe in a self. And like this is basically like Dr. Manhattan thinking. That's why I put this in here. It's like I have a live body and a dead body contain the same number of particles. Structurally, there's no discernible difference. Life and death are unquantifiable abstracts. Why should I be concerned? Like this is something they could have said. This could have come out of Dawkins or some of these people. It wouldn't sound out of character for them to say some bullshit like this. But you see that it's just like this completely. It's so far removed from reality in a sense. Like it makes you sound really smart, and you can sit and dunk on people for trying to believe in stuff and trying to create communities and religions and ideologies for humans to thrive. But the only thing you can do is just run in this kind of dead end circle of just debunking because it doesn't exist or it's too complicated. So that's why I call it like the Occam's razor self-harm. Basically, it's like you're cutting yourself with the Occam's razor, and it's like you said, just leaving negative space.
Yeah, the man cutting off his limbs there is a good.
But if you flip the slide again, there's a little bit more kind of juicy stuff on Dawkins here. So, I mean, post the selfish gene, there's sort of been a debate, or of course, if you ask Richard Dawkins, there's been no debate because his viewpoint is just like the dominating, it's the only sensible viewpoints. But you still have people in this sort of like professional scientist evolutionary sphere who believe in group selection. So Dave Sloan Wilson is one of them. I mean, he's written a lot of books Darwin's Cathedral is one where he gives like a more of an Darwinian account or explanation of religion and how it fits in with as a sort of survival mechanism for the group. Edward O. Wilson, I think, is the most interesting one because he's been in biology a long time. And he wrote this book that's called Sociobiology, The New Synthesis in 1975, where, I mean, he was basically shunned by the quote-unquote scientific community, even though his book is basically like, it's really just like the forerunner of evolutionary psychology that he proposed here. But he worked in a department that was basically full of Marxists. And you had organizations like Science for the People here, who basically tried to cancel him or try to shut him out, try to attack him and so on. Look at the Dawkins video first. It's called Dawkins Disavows, where he sort of comments on Edward O. Wilson's work.
Let me see here. Dawkins Disavows.
It's like this really short video. I hope it doesn't have any ads on it. But like this is, you will notice that like Dawkins is not willing to engage with this guy like in debates or anything like that. He's just, okay, you can hear his explanation if you run the clip.
I hate to put any sort of argument from authority, and goodness knows Ed Wilson himself is one of the greatest authorities in the world, but it is the case that when the paper by Novak, Taunita and Wilson came out, there was a reply to it by no fewer than 140 leading evolutionary biologists. I wasn't one of them actually, but there are 140 biologists who roundly condemned it. Now, I don't like arguing from authority, but nevertheless it would be a shame if people ran away with the idea that because Ed Wilson is a great biologist, somehow his authority carries weight here. This is one place where actually his authority doesn't carry weight, because it is, if we're going to argue from authority at all, it is massively outvoted by almost the entire rest of the field of evolutionary biologists.
And there you go.
Yeah.
But then, look at all these like hundreds of biologists who went out in against him. So if you look at the Science for the People link, let's look at these hundreds of evolutionary biologists who protested. Let's see what kind of people they are and why they protested. Let's see here. So there we have I mean, Science for the People is basically like this kind of new left Marxist organization for like Marxist biologists here. So here we go. Criticism of sociobiology. The biologists within the Science for the People were highly critical of sociobiology because of objectionable premises to organization of the discipline and for the implications of using sociobiology to support racism, capitalism, and imperialism. E.O. Wilson, biologist and ethnology professor in the Department of Organic, organismic the evolution of biology at Harvard University, whose book Sociobiology, The New Synthesis had helped start the debate, wrote the political objections forcefully made by the sociobiology study group of Science for the People in particular took me by surprise. So he is like, E.O. Wilson is not like some kind of based right-wing guy. Like he is just like this spurg who sits by himself, and he just sat in his own room and wrote it, and then he was just attacked by this kind of Marxist group. So if you go back to the article again, I just want you to look at some of the membership here. Let's see. You can either look in the sort of references, or I think it's at the bottom where you can find the list of notable members of this organization. Let's see there. There we go. Stephen J. Gold, Ruth Hubbard. So Levine here. We got Weissenbaum. We got a lot of interesting last names here. You know, you kind of see what's going on. If you go back to the sociobiology criticism, there you go. Sociobiology study group. Click on that link.
Where do you see it?
It's under notable members. See also sociobiology study group. No, up. You need to. It's in the paragraph above. Notable members, and you click on that one. You had it. It's under
there.
notable
Sorry,
members.
Yeah, there it is. Yep.
Study group. Let's see here.
Specifically to counter this guy.
Yeah, so they organized basically to this guy who's just like this totally clueless goyim who's writing his.
This guy
his
just
theory.
wrote his little book, and then he had like an entire task force to send on him. Poor guy. Yeah. Noam Chomsky. Yeah.
So of course,
Interesting.
I mean, you have like the regular. I think does it mention the ice bucket stuff here? Let's say, okay, yeah, just before this is the quote here. Just before November 1978, a speech was given by Wilson as part of the symposium. A group of protesters from the International Committee Against Racism (INCR) took control of the microphone, chanting, "Racist Wilson, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide." A couple of members then rushed Wilson and poured pitchers of ice water over his head. The symposium moderator, Alex Allen, took the microphone and apologized to Wilson. Stephen Jay Gould condemned the attacks as only posturing and thus an inappropriate attack on sociobiology. So, I mean, you talk about like cancel culture and like, oh, this is some new thing that's happening. No, this is basically like all of these like, you know, the specific group that we're dealing with here, like these Marxists who are basically organizing to stop like this evolutionary psychology for getting out and becoming a legitimate science. And just, you know, that's what's interesting here is that, you know, these Marxists, they actually prefer this kind of neoliberal individual view of evolution to the kind of integrated sociobiology because, you know, okay, at least it's neoliberalism, but it doesn't innately justify hierarchies. It doesn't innately justify, you know, male, women, male, female differences and things like that. So they knew immediately like this was dangerous for their worldview, and they needed to basically cancel him and intimidate him out of doing it. And Richard Dawkins has never come out and sort of try to condemn this stuff and saying that, you know, okay, these Marxists are ruining science. He just accepted it. Like he was totally fine with letting the Marxists shut up the people that he didn't agree with, right? So because
they don't come for him,
no, they don't come for him. They maintain like his you know, his hegemony on evolutionary theory and then try to keep it safe from competitors. He was completely fine with it. And these are the people who tell you to, like, to trust science and that science is neutral and all this kind of stuff. So, right. But that was sort of an interesting to look into that. I mean, if you don't need to watch the James Bradley stuff because we've already read the article, but I mean, when you hear about, you know, it's easy to hear that, you know, oh, the Edward, you know, group selection's been disavowed and it's not like scientifically viable because it's against the consensus. You have to be mindful of like what's the actual consensus in these universities and who are the people who are like trying to push this out. And so you can see it here. It's like this just clearly Marxist subversive influences.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, then I think we could just go to the last slide to finish up the presentation.
Matrix. Yeah.
To just sort of finish up, I had to add a lot of points here, but now we're sort of back to the idea of like, okay, these different paths of looking at evolution. When we had the idealism, that is like the traditional mode of thinking, the orthogenesis, it's the kind of theistic evolution. You have the gene selection Darwinism and the group selection Darwinism.
Yep.
And I mean, it's of course looking at it now, I think it's easy to just look for the amount of green check marks on this one and think that the one with the most green check marks is the best. But I mean, some of these points are not good. Let's say progressive, for instance, on the matrix, that it's in our view not really a positive thing to be progressive. Yep. But if you want to take anything from this, it's really that like this kind of Darwinist, you know, plotting it out in this matrix, you can see like this how this Darwinist gene selection view is just completely useless for us, like us politically. So it's degeneration,
I think.
So degeneration isn't possible. I mean, it's questionably it could be seen as progressive. It's not necessary, but it is. So if you look at it from this kind of like gene meme separation. Spontaneous order is checked off. Metaphysics is not possible. Collectivism is not possible. Determinism, yes. Moral integration, questionable. Cultural integration, questionable. It's not essentialist. It does not justify hierarchy innately, but it has a kind of academic consensus apparatus behind it. And if you look at the kind of group selection here, it's actually doing a lot better because collectivism is possible in like this kind of group, whether it's sociobiology or some other version of like group Darwinism, where you at least can integrate morality and you can integrate culture and you can have collectivism and hierarchy is justified within this frame. So, I mean, this is sort of my view from looking at it, is that if there's ever a question like this, the easiest thing for us would be to just try to double down, like in the dissident, right, to double down on this kind of group selection view of evolution.
Yeah.
And really try to guide it in that direction. I mean, the absolute best thing would be to like reinvigorate idealism. really, because that's actually the best one for us. But
yeah, obviously,
it's difficult with all of these kind of paradigm shifts and all of these things that we went through on the list.
Yeah, you need to work very hard to
I mean,
get
this
rid
is
of the truth regime in order to be able to live a life from that perspective.
I mean, I've started to sort of separate my kind of political prescriptions into two categories, where I have like the first world political prescription, I have a third world political prescription, depending on what the future looks like. Sure, and assuming that things, if things fall into total chaos and the supply lines break down and you have like social collapse and it becomes like The Walking Dead, then we're in the third world, right? And if we're in the third world, everything is up for grabs. So then we should just like, okay, you have to, you just form a band, and you have to like create this piratic band and kill the government, and then we just reinstitute idealism. But if it's really some other way of gaining power, that's really more of this covert first world. If we're able to maintain the infrastructure and all of and everything that comes with it, maintain the supply lines, maintain the research, the institutions,
then the group,
and the money, then basically it's really just about changing certain incentives in society. And then we have to just, remove all of these like gene selectionist people and just, okay, now like, group selection is basically the shit. That's how we teach evolution.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's really wraps up my
I think this is good. I think if you made it this far, you should probably pause and consider this, because I really like this matrix. It's very good.
Oof. Yeah, we've gone for almost 3.5 hours. It went longer than I
No, but
I expected.
It was interesting. It was very interesting, and I knew that before going in that this was going to be a good one. But I think we're out of time. I'm so tired and hot right now. It is very warm here, so I'm probably gonna have to go take a shower. Wow, that was harder than I thought. Do you have anything you want to say here at the end, Luddic?
Nah, I think I've said enough, honestly. Other than there's going to be a funny meme coming out on Saturday. That's the only thing I'm going to say.
Looking forward
the people
to
who follow my channel. Other than that, I guess you could, if you're still here, subscribe to our Subscribestar, maybe.
Yes, we have a Subscribestar. It is subscribestar.com/a-walrus. We are now sitting at $45 a month, which is great. We're only $5 away from our goal of $50 a month, which is going to be able to pay for our StreamYard's upgrade, which will make us able to stream in glorious 1080p and grant us some other quality of life tools here on the website. So thank you all for subscribing there, and if you would like to consider, head on over to subscribestar.com/a-walrus. You can subscribe for a $5, $10, or $15 per month. Depending on which one you choose, you'll gain access to different posts. I've started posting early video things I do privately. I'll post the transcripts of the video early, so if you want to read it as an article, that's a possibility. That being said, like, subscribe, comment, do the algorithm stuff, and I think that's everything we have. Thank you for this great presentation, Luddic. If there's anyone still hanging about who want more content for the evening, I know that Radical Liberation is streaming a bit earlier today, so go raid his. I'll put the link in the chat. He's talking about how the US is not in a recession right now. There's the link. Thank you all for watching, and we will probably not see you next week or the week after, but we will try to have a pre-recorded thing done at some point during the next 2 weeks. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.